Hello, everybody. Hello. Thank you for your patience. While we're waiting, I think we'll just move ahead with our schedule, and I'm going to ask our two members of the European Parliament to speak first and to welcome you here today.
Thank you so much for being here. I'm Christian Terhes, along with my colleague Ivan Sinčić, and some more colleagues right here in the front row. We are welcoming all of you in the European Parliament. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you so much for fighting, I would say, for the same cause all over the world. In October of 2021, when we started the first press conference in Strasbourg, where we tried to defend, first of all, our rights as MEPs to enter this building without a green certificate, and the rights of all the workers helping us right now, translating and doing all the technical work to be able to enter and do their job without being conditioned of a green certificate. We haven't realized at that point in time about the gravity and the seriousness of everything that was happening around the world. Initially, for us, it was a matter of principles. We were elected by the people, for the people. We should have been allowed to enter the building to perform what we were elected for. So we started small. We were 4 MEPs initially. All 4 of us are here. But then after 2 weeks, more MEPs reached out to us. When we posted the first press conference online, we were shocked by the many thousands of emails that we received from all over the world telling us, well, finally someone is saying something. Because everybody looked around and said, well, it's not good what is happening, but, you know, nobody, I would say, in politics or in civil society or even in the media was talking seriously about what was happening. So we started small, and just by kept asking questions, you know, presenting what was happening from our perspective, you know, more and more people got engaged. But on the other side of the ocean, you guys were doing what you were doing from a medical perspective. So now after a year and some months, we are kind of meeting together, you know, here in the European Parliament. On one side, us as MEPs fighting for freedom, for liberty. In Europe, in our case, I saw that many members of the US Congress are doing the same thing in the United States and in many other countries around the world. And I think the event today that we are hosting here in the European Parliament, the International COVID Summit, the 3rd edition, it is important mainly for all of us, you know, to share ideas and to know each other and to maybe come up with what we could do in the future. But more importantly, this event, it's important for all the hundreds of millions of people, maybe billions of people who will hear about this event and watch us, because what happened in the past 3 years is not okay. It's not okay from the perspective of democracy, it's not okay from the perspective of respect of human rights, and it is not okay from the medical perspective, because at the end of the day, when we hear someone saying that science says, well, you should allow the science to say whatever scientists have to say. But what we've seen what I've been seeing happening in the past 3 years is that some scientists were not allowed to even think otherwise than some bureaucrats or some unelected officials decided. So we have to stop that. And I'm really looking forward to all your presentations. Thank you so much for being here. And without further ado, I would say we are here to fight for you, for all of you, and we will be doing what was said. Thank you.
Thank you very much, dear colleague. Dear guests, dear friends, and all of our colleagues, welcome to International COVID Summit and welcome to European Parliament. We will be discussing scientific, social, medical and legal findings of the past 3 years of COVID crisis. Now, in my opening speech, I must state that I am honored to be with you all here today. I had an opportunity to be present at the first International COVID Summit in Rome in 2021, which had a focus on early treatments. I remember those were very dark times. I'm also very proud that you, during the heart of the COVID crisis, had spoken the scientific truth while under heavy mainstream media shelling and government discreditation attempts. In the meantime, we have been proven right on so many things, while the narrative of the pandemic marketing, as we call it in Croatia, has collapsed. It was us who followed the science, but we also followed human rights, rule of law, and the principle of freedom. Some bureaucrats and politicians in European institutions, national governments, and regulatory agencies are not yet ready to admit that they were wrong, because that would mean accountability, even before criminal law. But we will keep reminding them they will have to face consequences because the tide has turned against them. We are here to exchange findings and to send a strong message to European lawmakers and government agencies. The people of Europe and the world is expecting this from us. I am here today looking forward to hear your presentations on patents, effects of mandates, on early treatments, vaccine efficacy, effects on reproductive system, children, all-cause mortality, freedoms and legality surrounding COVID crisis, and many others. Thank you very much.
Hello, I'm Dr. Stephen Malthouse. I'm a general practitioner from the west coast of Canada. Don't usually get this kind of thing when I say my name.
Be
Usually when I say my name, the music doesn't come up like that. And the sky's open. But I'm Stephen Malthouse. I'm a family doctor from the west coast of Canada, and it's a pleasure to be here with everybody. And this is the third ICS International COVID Summit that we've had. We had one in Italy and one in France, and this is the third. And I wanted to thank our hosts here, the MEPs who've made such efforts to invite us here. And I also want to thank all the speakers who have come from around the globe to join us and to present today, because many of them have made quite the effort to come here. And I think we're all going to appreciate what they have to say. Just to let you know that there are headphones at the tables, and you can select on your console the language that you would like, because it is being translated into 7 languages. This is really a great opportunity for us. As you know, there have really been two pandemics. The first pandemic was really the one which was the storyline that we were all fed, that many of us swallowed whole, which came from our governments and other institutions. But the other pandemic is the one that we're going to be focusing on today, which is what happened after that first one was declared. The second, more the real pandemic. And what you're going to hear today may be surprising for some people. It may not necessarily fit with what you're thinking. But I ask you that you open your minds and listen to what the professionals, the experts here have to say, and to let you know that it is based on science and research. And in addition to opening your minds, I hope that you will open your hearts. You know, many people have suffered a lot in these last years, and I think that what you're going to hear today will make that very clear. So please approach these presentations with an open mind and an open heart. And I think that you will really enjoy the material that our speakers have to present for you today. So thank you very much, and we'll get started.
It is a particularly interesting location for me to be sitting today, given that over a decade ago I sat in this very chair right here in the European Union Parliament. And at that time I warned the world of what was coming. During that conversation that was hosted at the time by the Green and EFA and a number of the other parties of the European Union's various representations, we were having a conversation on whether Europe should adopt the United States policy of allowing for the patents on biologically derived materials. And at the time, I urged this body, and I urged people around the world, that the weaponization of nature against humanity had dire consequences. Tragically, I sit here today with that unfortunate line that I don't like to say, which I told you so. But the fact of the matter is, we're here not for a reprisal on past decisions. We're here to actually, once again, come to the face of the human condition and ask the question, who do we want to be? What do we want humanity to look like? And rather than seeing this as an exercise in futility, which is very easy from time to time when you're in the position I'm in, I actually see this not as an exercise in futility. I see this as one of the greatest opportunities that faces us, because we now have a public conversation, which is now front and center in people's minds. When this was an esoteric conversation about biological patents, nobody cared. But when that conversation came home, then it became something people can care about. So I'm actually quite grateful for this opportunity. I thank the members of Parliament for hosting this. I thank all of the translators who, I apologize in advance. I will use terminology that is probably very difficult to translate, so my apologies. And I'd also like to acknowledge the fact that many of you are aware of my involvement with this, in large part due to the amazing work of my wonderful wife, Kim Martin, who encouraged me at the very early days of this pandemic to get on front of the camera and talk about all the information that I had been sharing among very small groups around the world. And it was, in fact, her encouragement that put me in a place where many of you have heard what I have to say. Ironically, the world that I came from, that used to be very popular, my CNBC and Bloomberg presentations, which were televised on mainstream media around the world, was an audience that I lost. I can confidently say COVID diminished my fame. But I can also confidently say that I'd rather stand among the people with whom I'm standing today than any of the folks that were part of that previous world. So this is a much better place to be. My role today is to set the stage for this conversation in a historical context, because this did not come in the last 3 years. This did not come in the last 5 or 6 years. This actually is an ongoing question that probably began here in Europe in the early stages of the mid-1900s, but certainly by 1913, 1914, this conversation started right here in Central Europe. The pandemic that we alleged to have happen in the last few years also did not happen overnight. In fact, the very specific pandemic using coronavirus began in a very different time. And we'll try to advance the slides here with one of these things. Oh, there we go. Most of you don't know that coronavirus as a model of a pathogen was isolated in 1965. Coronavirus was identified in 1965 as one of the first infectious replicatable viral models that could be used to modify a series of other experiences of the human condition. It was isolated once upon a time associated with the common cold. But what's particularly interesting about its isolation in 1965 was that it was immediately identified as a pathogen that could be used and modified for a whole host of reasons. And you heard me correctly, that was 1965. And by the way, these slides are public domain. You're welcome to look at every single reference. Every comment that I made is based on published material, so do make sure that you look at those references. But in 1966, the very first COV coronavirus model was used as a transatlantic biological experiment in human manipulation. And you heard the date, 1966. I hope you're getting the point of what I'm saying. This is not an overnight thing. This is actually something that's been long in the making. A year before I was born, we had the first transatlantic coronavirus data sharing experiment between the United States and the United Kingdom. And in 1967, the year I was born, we did the first human trials on inoculating people with modified coronavirus. Isn't that amazing? 56 years ago, the overnight success of a pathogen that's been 56 years in engineering. And I want that to chill with all of you. Where were we when we actually allowed, in violation of biological and chemical weapons treaties, where were we as a human civilization when we thought it was an acceptable thing to do to take a pathogen for the United States and infect the world with it? Where was that conversation? And what should have been that conversation in 1967? That conversation wasn't had. Ironically, the common cold was turned into a chimera in the 1970s. And in 1975, 1976, and 1977, we started figuring out how to modify coronavirus by putting it into different animals, pigs and dogs. And not surprisingly, by the time we got to 1990, we found out that coronavirus as an infectious agent was an industrial problem for two primary industries, the industries of dogs and pigs. Dog breeders and pigs found that coronavirus created gastrointestinal problems, and that became the basis for Pfizer's first spike protein vaccine patent, filed, are you ready for this, in 1990. Did you hear what I just said? 1990, Operation Warp Speed. I'm sorry. Where's the warp and the speed? Pfizer, 1990, the very first spike protein vaccine for coronavirus. Isn't that fascinating? Isn't it fascinating that we were told that, well, the spike protein is a new thing. We just found out that that's the problem. No. As a matter of fact, we didn't just find out it was not just now the problem. We found that out in 1990 and filed the first patents on vaccines in 1990 for the spike protein of coronavirus. And who would have thought? Pfizer. Clearly the innocent organization that does nothing but promote human health. Clearly Pfizer. The organization that has not bought the votes in this chamber and in every chamber of every government around the world. Not that Pfizer. Certainly they wouldn't have had anything to do with this. But oh yes, they did. And in 1990, they found out that there was a problem with vaccines. They didn't work. You know why they didn't work? It turns out that coronavirus is a very malleable model. It transforms and it changes and it mutates over time. As a matter of fact, every publication on vaccines for coronavirus from 1990 until 2018, every single publication concluded that coronavirus escapes the vaccine impulse because it modifies and mutates too quickly for vaccines to be effective. And since 1990 to 2018, that is the published science, ladies and gentlemen. That's following the science. Following the science is their own indictment of their own programs that said it doesn't work. And there are thousands of publications to that effect, not a few hundred, and not paid for by pharmaceutical companies. These are publications that are independent scientific research that shows unequivocally, including efforts of the chimera modifications made by Ralph Baric in the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. All of them show vaccines do not work on coronavirus. That's the science. And that science has never been disputed. But then we had an interesting development in 2002. And this date is most important. Because in 2002, the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill patented, and I quote, an infectious replication defective clone of coronavirus. Listen to those words, infectious replication defective. What does that phrase actually mean? For those of you not familiar with language, let me unpack it for you. Infectious replication defective means a weapon. It means something meant to target an individual, but not have collateral damage to other individuals. That's what infectious replication defective means. And that patent was filed in 2002 on work funded by NIAID's Anthony Fauci from 1999 to 2002, and that work, patented at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, mysteriously preceded SARS 1.0 by a year. Dave, are you suggesting that SARS 1.0 wasn't from a wet market in Wuhan? Are you suggesting it might have come from a laboratory in the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill? No, I'm not suggesting it. I'm telling you that's the facts. We engineered SARS. SARS is not a naturally occurring phenomenon. The naturally occurring phenomenon is called the common cold. It's called influenza-like illness. It's called gastroenteritis. That's the naturally occurring coronavirus. SARS is the research developed by humans weaponizing a life system model to actually attack human beings. And they patented it in 2002. And in 2003, giant surprise, the CDC filed the patent on coronavirus isolated from humans in violation, once again, of biological and chemical weapons treaties and laws that we have in the United States. And I'm very, very precise on this. The United States likes to talk about its rights and everything else and the rule of law and all the nonsense that we like to talk about. But we don't ratify treaties about, I don't know, defending humans. We conspicuously avoid that. We actually have a great track record of advocating for human rights and then denying them when it comes to actually being part of the international community, which is a slightly problematic thing. But let's get something very clear. When the CDC in April of 2003 filed the patent on SARS coronavirus isolated from humans, what did they do? They downloaded a sequence from China and filed a patent on it in the United States. Any of you familiar with biological and chemical weapons treaties knows that's a violation. That's a crime. That's not an innocent oops. That's a crime. And the United States Patent Office went as far as to reject that patent application on 2 occasions until the CDC decided to bribe the Patent Office to override the patent examiner to ultimately issue the patent in 2007 on SARS coronavirus. But let's not let that get away from us, because it turns out that the RT-PCR, which was the test that we allegedly were going to use to identify the risks associated with coronavirus, was actually identified as a bioterrorism threat by me in the European Union-sponsored events in 2002 and 2003, 20 years ago. That happened here in Brussels and across Europe. In 2005, this particular pathogen was specifically labeled as a bioterrorism and bioweapon platform technology. Described as such. That's not my terminology that I'm applying to it. It was actually described as a bioweapons platform technology in 2005. And from 2005 onwards, it was actually a biowarfare enabling agent, its official classification from 2005 forward. I don't know if that sounds like public health to you. Does it? Biological warfare enabling technology. That feels like not public health. That feels like not medicine. That feels like a weapon designed to take out humanity. That's what it feels like. And it feels like that because that's exactly what it is. We have been lured into believing that EcoHealth Alliance and DARPA and all of these organizations are what we should be pointing to. But we've been specifically requested to ignore the facts that over $10 billion have been funneled through black operations through the check of Anthony Fauci and a side-by-side ledger where NIAID has a balance sheet and next to it is a biodefense balance sheet equivalent dollar-for-dollar matching that no one in the media talks about. And it's been going on since 2005. Our gain-of-function moratorium, the moratorium that was supposed to freeze any efforts to do gain-of-function research. Conveniently, in the fall of 2014, the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill received a letter from NIAID saying that while the gain-of-function moratorium on coronavirus in vivo should be suspended, because their grants had already been funded, they received an exemption. Did you hear what I just said? A biological weapons lab facility at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, received an exemption from the gain-of-function moratorium so that by 2016 we could publish the journal article that said SARS coronavirus is poised for human emergence in 2016. And what, you might ask, Dave, was the coronavirus poised for human emergence? It was WIV1. Wuhan Institute of Virology Virus 1. Poised for human emergence in 2016 at the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, such that by the time we get to 2017 and 2018, the following phrase entered into common parlance among the community. There is going to be an accidental or intentional release of a respiratory pathogen. The operative word, obviously, in that phrase, the word release. Does that sound like leak? Does that sound like a bat and a pangolin went into a bar in the Wuhan market and hung out and had sex and lo and behold, we got SARS-CoV-2? No. Accidental or intentional release of a respiratory pathogen was the terminology used, and 4 times in April of 2019, 7 months before the allegation of patient number 1, 4 patent applications of Moderna were modified to include the term accidental or intentional release of a respiratory pathogen as the justification for making a vaccine for a thing that did not exist. Keep going. If you have not done so, please make sure that you make reference in every investigation to the premeditation nature of this, because it was in September of 2019 that the world was informed that we were going to have an accidental or intentional release of a respiratory pathogen so that by September 2020, there would be a worldwide acceptance of a universal vaccine template. That's their words, right in front of you on the screen. The intent was to get the world to accept a universal vaccine template, and the intent was to use coronavirus to get there. And the last slide. This isn't advancing, so if I could have somebody do it. Let's read this, because we have to read this into the record everywhere I go. Until an infectious disease crisis is very real, present, and at the emergency threshold, it is often largely ignored. To sustain the funding base beyond the crisis, he said, we need to increase the public understanding for the need for medical countermeasures such as a pan-influenza or pan-coronavirus vaccine. A key driver is the media, and the economics will follow the hype. We need to use that hype to our advantage to get to the real issues. Investors will respond if they see profit at the end of the process. Sounds like public health? Sounds like the best of humanity? No, ladies and gentlemen, this was premeditated domestic terrorism stated at the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2015, published in front of them. This is an act of biological and chemical warfare perpetrated on the human race, and it was admitted to in writing that this was a financial heist and a financial fraud. Investors will follow if they see profit at the end of the process. Let me conclude by making 5 very brief recommendations. The last slide. Nature was hijacked. This whole story started in 1965 when we decided to hijack a natural model and decide to start manipulating it. Science was hijacked when the only questions that could be asked were questions authorized under the patent protection of the CDC, the FDA, the NIH, and their equivalent organizations around the world. We didn't have independent science. We had hijacked science. And unfortunately, there was no moral oversight in violation of all of the codes that we stand for. There was no independent, financially disinterested, independent review board ever impaneled around coronavirus, not once. Not once. Not since 1965. We do not have a single independent IRB ever impaneled around coronavirus. So morality was suspended for medical countermeasures. And ultimately, humanity was lost because we decided to allow it to happen. Our job today is to say, no more gain-of-function research, period. No more weaponization of nature, period. And most importantly, no more corporate patronage of science for their own self-interest unless they assume 100% product liability for every injury and every death that they maintain. Thank you very much.
David's right. In fact, I couldn't be calling my talk now The Science of Lockdowns and Mandates, because that would be a presentation with no slides. I'm Nick Hudson. I'm the chairman of an organization called PANDA, Pandemics Data and Analytics, now global, but originally set up in South Africa in the very early days of the COVID-19 lockdowns to push back against the absence of science and reason in the invocation of these extreme mandates, unprecedented mandates. Have I got the advancing button, David?
You do have the advancing button, but it didn't advance.
Okay. Let's try again. Is somebody else controlling the slides?
I think they're controlled over there.
There we go. So the narrative that we were asked to accept in relation to COVID was a simple and, let's say, deadly one. A deadly novel virus was sweeping the planet. Nobody was immune and there was no cure. Asymptomatic people were major drivers of disease spread. And so we had to lock down and wear our masks until everyone was vaccinated. Note that there were 3 mandates in that sentence: lockdowns, masks, vaccines. And anyone who challenged that narrative was a danger, a menace to society. Next slide. But this was an unjustified fear in the face of reality. The reality was, next slide please, that a virus that represented high risk to very few and negligible risk to most had hit some regions of the world. Few people were susceptible to severe disease, and there were several available treatments. Asymptomatic people were not drivers of disease spread. Lockdowns and mask mandates that had never been recommended before were tried, but very early on it was clear that they didn't work and that they caused great harm. So what ended up happening was that the vulnerable people were hurt instead of being helped. Next slide. The biggest lie, perhaps, of the entire story was this one. Tedros, head of the Global World Health Organization, in a very sneaky move, conflated what is known as a case fatality rate with an infection fatality rate. Case fatality rate being the rate at which people who are already sick and presenting at hospitals die from a disease. An infection fatality rate being the rate at which people who are infected, many of whom who will have no ill effects from that infection, die, and they're 2 completely different things. So when he said that COVID had a fatality rate of 3.4%, that was a case fatality rate, and he compared it to the fatality rate for the flu, which was an infection fatality rate, much less than 1%. Next slide, please. What actually emerged as the reality early on, and I want to just point something out about this presentation. In order to make the point that we knew this in time to prevent any of this from happening, these slides only contain information available in the first year of the COVID phenomenon. I have put not an ounce of novel information into these slides except for the last one. John Ioannidis did a seroprevalence study where we can detect infection fatality rates, average them across the world, and in the first one that he conducted, he found that the infection fatality rate was not 3.4%, but 0.23%. In subsequent updates to that material, the rate has fallen to 0.1%, and I would just point out that that rate includes in its numerator a tendency to massively over-attribute COVID deaths all around the world. The real infection fatality rate in this disease is less than 0.1%. And when we consider, next slide please, the fact that mortality is, next slide please, the fact that mortality is massively age graduated, with the risk for young people being 1,000th the risk for old people. When we consider that fact, it is completely correct to say that COVID never ever presented anything but a de minimis risk to even vaguely healthy people under the age of 70 years old. And when I say vaguely healthy, I mean not in hospital owing to a severe comorbidity. That's not a high hurdle. For all of those people, which is the vast majority of the world's population, COVID presented de minimis risk. Next slide, please. Another little lie straight out of the blocks. The novel virus. There is only one useful sense of the word novel, and that is in terms of universal susceptibility or immune naivety. When it comes to viruses, every single copy of a virus virtually is something novel in the sense that it contains errors of transcription or some element of novelty. Almost every single copy would be like that. So if you set a low threshold, novelty is a meaningless term. It's only meaningful in terms of susceptibility. And Tedros told this lie that the name, it mattered to have a name that prevented the use of stigmatization, COVID-19. Next slide, please. The reason this was a terrible lie, next slide, please. Sorry, there we go. Is this virus was identified very early on by the International Committee for the Taxonomy of Viruses as being an individuum of SARS-1. An individuum means something that doesn't qualify for recognition even as a different subspecies. An individuum is like me and David. We're individua of Homo sapiens sapiens. So the ICTV was proposing the name SARS-2, which would have made novelty a joke. And they pointed this out in a paper that has since been memory holed, deleted even from Wayback Machines. This was a scam, the idea of novelty. Next slide, please. And it was acknowledged very early on as well by the World Health Organization's Maria van Kerkhove that the majority of the world's population was susceptible to infection from this virus, even though that this was not actually the case. Multiple studies emerged in 2020 demonstrating that upwards of 80% of the human population had pre-existing immunity to SARS-CoV-2. Next slide, please. And we saw this very clearly in the geographic distribution of the early spread of this virus. Even though SARS-CoV-2 was detected globally, we only had pronounced mortality in certain regions of the world. The vast majority of the human population did not, in that year, develop anything significant in terms of mortality. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. And the myth of asymptomatic transmission is another crucial one to appraise. We had it very early on that this was complete garbage. The papers that set up this myth were derisory. The one was based on a single Chinese woman who apparently infected her colleagues while asymptomatic, but it later emerged that she had been treated by her doctor for influenza-like syndromes. Next slide, please. And the World Health Organization, again, Maria van Kerkhove came out saying asymptomatic spread was very rare, but then she was forced to walk back that statement. Next slide, please. Fauci knew this as well in advance. Next slide, please. And early papers in 2020, this one from December, found that symptomatic index cases represented the vast majority of the explanations for anybody contracting COVID in a household context. Next slide, please. The biggest lie of them all, maybe, second biggest, was that lockdown saved lives. This man, Bruce Elwood, emerged from China having done no science of any shape or form, saying that the whole world needed to imitate China. Next slide. And what we also knew before that was that every single extant guideline of pandemic response theory had ruled out the possibility or as a recommendation, lockdowns or isolation even of the sick. So next slide, please. And multiple studies emerged very early on that showing that there was no benefit evident in the data to not just the implementation of lockdowns, but the implementation of NPIs in general. Next slide, please. This finding was not unexpected from John Ioannidis again, that in fact there was evidence that lockdowns were pro-contagion. Why do I say this is not unexpected? Well, remember that I mentioned that this was we had profoundly age-graduated mortality, older people being much more susceptible than younger people. What you need to do from a transmission perspective to minimize mortality under those conditions is to maximize the differential mobility of the elderly and the young. And that is a well-known result from epidemiological modeling. Now just process that. You need young people to be as mobile as possible in relative to old people. That's the opposite of a lockdown. What you ideally want is actually a coronavirus party for everybody under the age of about 80. A cruise ship for the rest of us, while the old people stay out of the way. That would have been the mortality minimizing strategy suggested by basic epidemiology. That result is expected. Next slide, please. And we saw it in the evidence very early on. This was Panda's slide. The work was done in May of 2020. That's a splatter plot. That's the relationship on the x-axis between the stringency of lockdowns and the actual COVID mortality that was experienced, each of those dots representing a country somewhere in the world. And when you get a paint splat like that, what it means is there's no relationship between lockdowns and COVID mortality. If there was, next slide please, we would have seen a pattern like this, a line showing that as the stringency of lockdowns increased, the mortality from COVID decreased. But we saw nothing of the sort, nothing at all. Next slide, please. Comparing side by side two countries, the UK and Sweden, the one with a famously stringent lockdown and the one that famously did not lock down, you see no difference whatsoever in the evolution of their pandemic curves. Next slide, please. And we're in the same way that lockdowns didn't save lives, we saw the same thing with masks, North Dakota and South Dakota, with a mask mandate, without a mask mandate. Their pandemic curves almost identical. You can barely tell them apart. Next slide, please. And here's how ridiculous it got. When the modelers started advising everybody to lock down, and Sweden refused to lock down, this is what they projected for Sweden. They projected that Sweden in 2020 would experience a burden of mortality twice its normal level. In the end, this is what they got. Next. Something that was bang in line with the average mortality that they had experienced over the previous 10 years. You cannot believe how far out those initial models that put us into lockdown were. And of course, lockdowns are harmful. I would just like to scroll through these slides one by one until we get past them. UNICEF predict that there would be 1.2 million child deaths as a result of lockdowns. Keep going, keep going. 150 million people pushed into extreme poverty. 130 million people threatened by starvation. Over 40 million new jobless claims worldwide. And so on. Keep going, keep going. So what we'd done was lockdown, shifting the burden of disease from the young to the very people who were vulnerable, the elderly. And that resulted in the killing of more vulnerable people than would otherwise have taken place. These things had a profoundly negative impact at multiple levels, and it was predicted and predictable. Next slide. It's worthwhile remembering how quickly the opinion shifted in these matters. Look at what the World Health Organization said on the 1st of March compared to what it said on the 5th of June. And there was no high-quality emergent scientific evidence between these two dates. In fact, there never has been. The best quality evidence probably is the Cochrane study, finding that there was absolutely no reason to expect that masks worked. That's a fairly recent paper, hence not a slide in the presentation. Next one, please. I'm going to just keep going in the interest of time. Please go forward, and go forward, and go forward. Tom Jefferson, well-known epidemiologist, had this to say about his sense of the situation. Sometimes you get the impression that the whole industry is waiting for a pandemic to happen. The interesting thing is that he said this at the time of another hoax pandemic in 2009, the H1N1 hoax. I think he was right then, and even more right if he had repeated those statements today. And of course, we can see quite transparently that this was all done in the name of launching a vaccine story. 7.8 people suddenly needed to get vaccinated, and nobody would be safe unless everyone was safe. And the complete lie of all of that again. It was known in advance even of the mRNA vaccine's advent that a nasal spray vaccine had no chance of preventing transmission and infection because it sets up only systemic immunity. Is that my time? Good. So there again, and this is a fact belatedly recognized by Anthony Fauci. He came out saying, look, we made a bit of a mistake. This is a couple of months ago. We should have made a nasal spray vaccine, right? Next slide. And so there we had it, a collection of lie after lie after lie. And the frightening thing about this, as a way of concluding, is this wasn't even a conspiracy. It wasn't even a conspiracy. It was straight, outright collusion. Why do I say this? All this information was in the public domain. Everything that David presented was in the public domain. Some of it isn't today. It's been memory hold and removed from the Wayback Machines even. Who's doing that? I don't know. The only reason this term conspiracy theorist is around is because when they call me a collusion theorist, it doesn't sound nearly as insulting. That's the only reason. It's straight outright collusion, and we all should be seeing it, and we all should be recognizing that COVID was in no way, shape, or form a medical phenomenon. This was a political phenomenon. And the politicians around the world I believe, are starting to wake up to this. And the earliest and the bravest amongst them are here today and are the reason we are here today. And I would like to finish by congratulating them and thanking them.
Good morning, and I wish to start thanking Mrs. Francesca Donato and the other members of the Parliament for kindly invitation to this meeting. I am a pathologist, and I will bring you the point of view of the biologist and of the medical doctor and of the professor of pathology. As a molecular pathologist, my task and my duty is to study the molecular mechanisms of diseases, whatever is the cause, in this case COVID, and also the adverse effects of the vaccines. So the double take-home message of my lecture is here. COVID-19 has been presented as a rather unknown disease, a novel disease, which is not completely true, as I will show you. And the other message is that we could have done it better. We could have managed better by just remembering what we teach to the medical student at the third year. So let me start presenting you what is COVID. COVID is essentially, it presents with symptoms of a flu with mild to moderate intensity in the majority of the cases, with fever, loss of appetite, fatigue, and muscle aches, shortness of the breath. But these symptoms would relieve in the majority of cases within 8-10 days with no consequences and leaving immunity. There are cases where the pathology has a more severe course, where the patient experiences difficulty in walking, confusion, coughing up blood, and persistent chest pain. And again, in a few percentage of cases, the disease can progress and develop a respiratory syndrome, a distress syndrome, and may have this multi-organ failure with fatal outcome. This happens especially in elders with comorbidity. So this is bringing the patient to the ICU, and of course this has brought a work overload to our healthcare workers. Now, why I'm pointing to the importance of history? Because it was not, at the end, a truly unknown disease, because the severe acute respiratory syndrome was described by Carlo Urbani in 2003. He was the first one describing this disease in a patient who was hospitalized in Hanoi. And he was an expert in tropical diseases, so they asked him for a consultation. Unfortunately, he got the disease. He understood that it was a respiratory virus causing that. And in fact, he died, unfortunately, just a few weeks later, and he asked first to use his lungs to check what was going on. And you can see what is going on in the lungs. If you leave untreated the patient, then some of them can develop an interstitial fibrosis. And when you get that, of course, there is no way to have gas exchange. So you can see, in fact, that the virus was at the beginning named novel coronavirus, but then they had to rename it as SARS-CoV-2, just because it is very much similar to SARS-CoV, the one that caused the SARS described by Carlo Urbani. There is, however, one important difference in the genome. You can see that in the sequence for the spike protein, there is a cleavage site which makes this virus more infective, yet much less lethal, which is logic if you think of the evolution of microorganisms, especially the virus. They can survive only if they live alive, the host. And in fact, you can see here that the virus can enter the cells in two ways. That's why it is more infective. One way is through endocytosis, the other way is through fusion with the plasma membrane of the cell. But in both cases, once it is inside the cell, the messenger RNA will be released, translated into proteins, then the virus assembles within the membranes of the host cell, and then will go out and infect other cells. Now, I point out the importance of the vascular system in the cell, which is a protective system. It is the autophagy lysosomal degradation pathway. And the virus exploits and somehow modulates this pathway to escape degradation. But in the majority of the case, next slides, please. In the majority of the cases, the cell can recognize foreign viruses and entrap the virus into this vascular system for degradation, and then will inform the immune system of the attack. What happens is that in the elders, this degradation pathway is not so efficient, and virus can somehow hijack this pathway. So in that case, what happens is that we have a hyperinduction of the inflammatory and immune response, which leads to what we call cytokine storm. Now, again, we had and we have many inhibitors. You can see they are listed there, inhibitors and monoclonal antibody that can stop the cytokine storm. Now, if we go back to the disease, you can see that the lungs are the main organ affected, but also the intestine and other organs might be interested. And what happens is that the upper and lower respiratory tract are affected, but also it's important to stress the vasculature, so the endothelial cells, and what is the renin-angiotensin system, which controls our blood pressure. Now, this is happening in the severe cases, and what you can see, it is driven by the cytokine storm where interleukin-6 is playing the major role. Now, look at the right side. Interleukin-6 is doing more than just driving the inflammation, is telling the liver to produce coagulation proteins, is telling the bone marrow to produce platelets. So no surprise if you then get intravascular coagulation disseminated. And in fact, next please, this is, okay. The first fatal mistake is this, no autopsy. And we are pathologists. If you do not perform an autopsy, you cannot find out what's the reason of death. And I like also to stress the aphorism of Heraclitus saying that you will never find the truth if you are not willing to accept it. So it's important that you look for the truth if you want to find it. The next, please. So let's go back to the cytokine storm. And this is, as I said, is causing at the end the disseminated intravascular coagulation with thromboembolism. And this is what we could have discovered with autopsies. You can see what happens in the lung. That is an alveoli of the lung. And you can see that there is, because of the hyperinflammation, activation of fibroblasts. They will produce collagen fibers, and these will make very, very difficult for the gas to be exchanged. But what else is happening? The presence of thromboembolism. So at that point, giving oxygen to the patient is useless. And that's the reason why our patients, once they enter the ICU, it was too late. They could not be saved. The next, please. And what's the second fatal mistake? Keep them home with paracetamol, which is only treating fever. It's not counteracting inflammation. So if you leave the patients at home with the wait and see and just treating fever, of course, after 15 days, as I showed before, they will come to you with the interstitial fibrosis, but that is too late. But you can see there is no literature supporting that treatment. Instead, you can see, and we learned again from the previous SARS, that we could treat our patients, and many of us have treated the patients with just regular anti-inflammatory drugs, and with supplements supporting the immune system and counteracting the oxidative stress. And you can see there some publication. There is also one my paper pointing on the importance of modulating autophagy again. So now what happens is that after 2 years and more than 200,000 deaths, it has been published then that indeed with anti-inflammatory drugs we could have done better. Next, please. Then I move to the molecular mechanisms underlying the other effects of the spike protein affecting the cardiovascular system and causing altered control of the blood pressure and so on. And you can see this is done by the spike, whether it comes from the virus or it comes from the so-called vaccine. And what happens is that it is depleting ACE2, which is controlling blood pressure. Next, please. And next, yes. And in fact, this vaccine, so-called vaccine, unfortunately, has not been made in a good way, because it is driving the synthesis of this spike protein, and it is, by the way, a spike protein modified. The messenger RNA, you can see it binds to ACE2 more avidly, and the mRNA has been modified to be stabilized, so it is not recognized, not destroyed by the cell. It cannot trigger the antiviral interferon step. So we could have done better by using also omics technology. Next, please. Omics technology would have allowed to make a personalized profile of our patients to understand who was really susceptible to this disease to protect. Next slide, please. We could have used omics technology to profile our patients for a personalized vaccination, excluding the patients recovered from the infection who are already immunized, or those patients who are under immunosuppressive therapy or are immunodeficient. They cannot respond anyhow. Whatever you can do, 4, 5, 10 every month you can vaccinate. They cannot respond. So we should have used these technologies to profile who could really benefit from vaccination. Next, please. And to conclude, indeed, the virus is very much similar to the well-known SARS-CoV-1. COVID disease was not so completely unknown and could be cured with appropriate therapy, early therapy. Thanks. And we could have done better if we would have done the autopsy. We would have studied the cellular and molecular pathways of infection. We would have treated the patients early. We would have remembered pathology that is just learned back in the textbook. Then profiling our patients. So in simple words, we could have said by trusting through science, not having faith in technology. That is the big mistake. And I wish to conclude with my hero, our hero, Giordano Bruno. He said, if this science, and nowadays it is only technology, not science, which will bring great advantage to man, will not help man to understand himself, then it will end up turning against man. Thanks very much for your attention.
Good morning, Giovanni Meledandri. I thank you very much, the Euro parliamentaries, and particularly Francesca Donato, for having invited me to this occasion, and I'm honored to be among you all. We have a few minutes, and my purpose is to provide, if I can, some clarification, alleviate some doubts, and possibly even focus on some risks, some more risks. Please listen to me, because I want to be short and sweet. And then, if you like, you can read later, at your convenience, the slides. The things I'm going to tell you are probably well known to colleagues. May I have the tomorrow? Yes.
It doesn't work. Just ask for them. Just ask them.
Okay. So, just the second one, please. Oh, thank you very much.
It doesn't work.
Okay. I wanted to recall them all because the audience is very large and the dissemination of information in recent years has been not always been equable and excellent. Confusion, unfortunately, has produced suffering and damage. Julius Caesar said in Shakespeare's tragedy of his name, "The man fears most what he does not know." We will try to clarify what and why we do know. In slide 2, I wanted to summarize the discussion. We will discuss SARS-CoV-2 and COVID-19. We will address aspects involving morphology origin, pathogenesis, immunology, prophylaxis, and the current situation. And the fifth set of slides, just next one. And please, we are going to show the slides from 3 to 10 quite quickly. In slide 2, I wanted to summarize the discussion. In the fifth set of slides, I said, we shall see the morphology and the characteristics genomic of SARS-CoV-2. These slides serve to remove any possible doubt about the technology of the virus. The virus is well known, and Huey has classified it. We know exactly what it looks like, how big it is, 10 nanometers, 22 kilobases, you prefer. It is an NRA positive strand. How its genome works. And we assigned it to the subgenus Sabercovirus because of its particular feature. Next one, please. Go on. Go on. Go on. You are going to see the phylogenesis and the morphology of the virus on. This is the genetic description of the virus on. And this is collocation in the taxonomy. As I said, the SARS-CoV-2 virus has a unique characteristics, and this is the reason why we assign it to the Sabercovirus. He binds to the AC2 receptor. I think that you are fed up with this. You have heard, I think, too much about the AC2 receptor, but I'm afraid that it's not enough. Let us recall some aspects concerning, I would like just to go a bit back. Move back, please, to, I think, the third one. Back, 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 back. Okay, that's right. This slide deals with the ERCON0, it's known as the coefficient of reproduction. Probably in the first years about the epidemiology of the SARS-CoV-2 virus, we heard a lot about this problem. But what is the coefficient of reproduction? It's a measure of how effective is a disease. And officially, it has been calculated to be between 2 and 4. I can add that the SARS-CoV-2 has a very specific coefficient, and it is 3, and it is an horizontal one. And probably epidemiology will know what I mean. An horizontal coefficient differs from a spherical one. A horizontal coefficient means that if I become infective, I can communicate the disease to one, and this one can communicate my disease to one more, horizontally. That's all. Look in your memory. If probably, I think, unfortunately, everybody knows the problem. If you just get your memory, probably you'll find that in your relatives, in your family, in your experience, when one gets the virus, he can communicate it to one, and this one to one more, then it stops. And this is the reason why in some family, one became ill, one more, and then no more. Let's move on. From the sequence of disease, sorry, I've been operated on my eyes, I have some problem. Can we go on, please? On? On? Can you move faster? One. Again. Again. Okay. From the sequence, we can derive the capability of the viruses and we can trace its origin. This is another big problem. The slide 1115 deals with the phylogenesis. And I want to clarify that, as Professor Martin said, and yesterday also Professor Anderson, the coronavirus family is a very old one. And of course, it has been well studied, and it is so old that we can date it to 25, 50 million years. And this has some consequences. First, a progressive reduction in the pathogenicity. Second, a high genetic sharing. In very simple words, it means that coronaviruses evolving have produced little serious and generally less and less lethal diseases in animals and eventually, finally, in humans. And that the DNA of animals is the reservoir in which we can find the relics of this ancient cohabitation. I remind you that no less, Professor Anderson said this yesterday, I particularly appreciated it, not less than 8% of DNA in eukaryotes is derived from the horizontal spread of foreign genetic material, mainly carried by virus. We evolve thanks to virus. Our DNA contains information, genetical information, driven through the biosphere by virus, and sometimes they get it from mushrooms. And in this big system, the genetic evolve. Nature makes use of this tool for evolutionary purposes, and among its benefits we find viral interference. Does anybody know that flu, dengue fever, measles, German measles simply disappeared these years? Do you think that it was thanks to masks? No. It simply was thanks to interference. Interference is the ability to be little to no susceptible to certain infection. And this is one of the virtues of the natural, complex human immunity. Slide 1114, can we go there? Please help me. Just show 11, 12, 13, and 14. Is devoted to the origin. Yes, stay just one moment there. And this is the conclusion of a long process, a long discussion, and I think that Professor Martin explored it deeply. There is no evidence which animals were where the virus came from. This is George Gale last month, and that's all. No animal. And I just want to suggest you just a little provocation. If the pangolin and the bats wanted to mix and share the coronavirus, they have enough to share. They had 25 million years to do, and they did not. When they were face to face in the Central Europe, the Koch Institute deals with this matter, and Professor Claudia Cole studies. In a study I published, I cited it, this problem. And why now the pangolin and the bat should have made their marriage in Wuhan. It looked very strange, and of course it's completely refused analyzing the sequence. In slides 16, 19, I summarize, we can move on, the pathogenicity. This is another interesting point because it all opens by recalling that the SARS-CoV-2 does not differ, we said, from any other virus and is the result of the genetics of the virus and the reaction of the host to make the pathogenesis. Whatever symptoms and causes we want to deal with, it is not permissible within reason to be surprised by this, because any triplets of genes give us information about cause, etc. I have to move faster. We think when, and we can read it in the slides, when the virus came into the cell, and you have many ways to get inside. I just resumed 4 of them. At the end of the replication, it puts a black spot in the cell. It's the ubiquitination. When it puts the black spots, the cells has to commit suicide. The cell must die to let the viruses out. If you go fast and deal with the immunization, I want to stress that the definition of immunization is well shown. Just move fast. Till 34, please. Go on. This is the coherence. Okay, go on. You have 1 minute. Stop. We know what is immunization, and I try to summarize what is this immunity. It is not just a title of antibodies. When we deal with efficacy of a treatment, a immunological one, and use the measure of antibodies, we are joking. We can have antibodies, but we don't know if they are protective, and we don't know against what. It's a measure, it's useful, but it's not enough. And one more, we so far talked about viruses. If we just move to nanoliposomes, nanoliposomes do not deliver some things, the material genetic, to the cell. The genetic material they contain penetrates the cell, profiting the natural features of the membrane and the mechanism by which the fusion and entry into the interior of every cell take place. Is not a delivery. The genetic material is then subjected to complex processes, but this is subject to errors, and errors are enlarged by the decoherence. I did not explain the decoherence, I had no time to do, but I suggest strongly you to have a read at the slides about the coherence. And finally, when a virus goes out, or when any genetic material have to go out, this happens exclusively by membrane rupture. The membrane must exploit. The cell must die. If the cell don't die, it does not occur. Then, when the cell dies, the subendothelial tissue and all the tissues are involved in an inflammatory disease. In conclusion, we have a phenomenology that is much more complex than the one we use in traditional vaccines when we are using mRNA vaccine. And if we want to talk about this treatment, I strongly suggest not to use sense, meaning neologisms. Epicure, Lucretius made it because they had no way to translate the Greek to Latin, but we have an excellent scientific terminology, and I think that we should be very strict in designating. I never call mRNA treatment a vaccine. Finally, move, please. This is just one moment, this is just to have an idea of the immunology and how complex it is in COVID-19. This is a 15-year-old girl. He had the virus only in the bowel, so they spent a lot of time to make a correct diagnosis. I have to call the hospital. It was, I don't want to identify them, telling them, look, colleagues, it is COVID, but it's negative. It is COVID. Make a rectal swab. And the girls had the MISC. People from the USA well know what is NISC. This is the most serious case we had in Italy. As I said, just move on at the end. Go on. This is the definition. The 13 points on, please. Yes, stay there, just one moment. The epidemiology gives us a clear scenario and a tool to analyze and master what happens. We have just to set the independent and the dependent variables. If the independent is the cause, is pizza or is the climatic change, well, just measure it. And if the dependent variable are the adverse effect, and in the slides you read that I did not call them adverse, I just call them effects, well, we'll shall measure by a simple regression, logistic regression, who is the guilty, who is the bad fellow, the climate, the pizza, or whatever it is. I want to conclude, just on, please. And just furnish one more. Next, please. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Oh, this is vice versa. I want to thank you very much. Just go back. I was just to tell you that we are not in the common area, but in the COVID area. Thank you very much, everybody.
I medici, esempi eroici impegnati in prima linea, in tutti i settori e specialità, nei reparti ospedalieri, sul territorio, nell'assistenza domiciliare e nella ricerca scientifica, che con grande coraggio e profondo senso di umanità hanno operato al di là delle umane possibilità, mettendo spesso a rischio la propria vita, affrontando un virus sconosciuto, senza risparmio di energie, privilegiando la salute del paziente e l'azione di contrasto della pandemia rispetto alla sicurezza personale.
Intanto buona mattinata a tutti, signore e signori. Parlo in italiano perché è la mia lingua e trovo rispettare anche la lingua italiana, che è una lingua ufficiale di questo Parlamento. Questa medaglia d'oro è stata data al Presidente dell'Ordine dei Medici, anzi al Presidente della Federazione Nazionale dell'Ordine dei Medici. Ordine dei Medici che sospendevano, radiavano. Io stesso sono stato sospeso. Sono al mio terzo procedimento per non aver seguito fondamentalmente le linee guida, per aver dato farmaci che secondo loro non si dovevano dare ai pazienti e quindi per aver curato 9.000 persone, 9.000 casi di Covid. Questa non sarà una relazione scientifica, ma una storia personale che si mescola però con la storia di quanto è successo in Italia. Voi sapete, l'Italia è stata la prima nazione occidentale a essere colpita pesantemente, soprattutto dall'epidemia di Covid. Facciamo un salto indietro nel tempo. Siamo al 23 gennaio 2020 e inizia il primo e grandissimo lockdown cinese della storia, da cui arrivano dati allarmanti. Un amico mi informava da Wuhan su quanto avveniva nella sua città. Nel frattempo io, che sono curioso, come ogni medico dovrebbe essere, andavo a ricercarmi la letteratura scientifica che era stata fatta, ce l'hanno anche detto i colleghi, già sulla SARS, la prima SARS, e su quanto iniziarono a pubblicare i medici cinesi, preparandomi al peggio e essere pronto a intervenire, come credo ogni medico degno di questo nome avrebbe dovuto fare. Il 31 gennaio 2020, uno dei più famosi virologi italiani, il professor Burioni, dichiara in televisione che il Covid-19, che ancora non aveva quel nome, in Italia non sarebbe mai arrivato, date le precauzioni delle autorità sanitarie italiane. E nella stessa sera il nostro Ministro della Salute dichiara, nella stessa trasmissione, l'Italia è pronta. Non lo erano. Il piano pandemico non era stato aggiornato dal 2006 e alcune delle poche mascherine che avevano nei magazzini furono inviate in Cina come gesto di solidarietà. I posti di letto in terapia intensiva erano stati ridotti di oltre un terzo negli anni precedenti per risparmiare sulle spese. Poi scoprirò che quando gli ospedali di Bergamo, Cremona e Milano erano in emergenza e non avevano dispositivi di protezione individuale, a Malpensa, aeroporto di Malpensa, il Ministero della Salute aveva magazzini pieni di scatoloni di mascherine, guanti, tutte di biocontenimento e persino maschere antigas che venivano tenute per sé e che regolarmente venivano buttate e sostituite perché scadevano. Grande esempio di solidarietà e di svolgimento del compito di tutelare la salute dei cittadini e dei medici e degli infermieri e degli operatori sociosanitari. E anche su questo la magistratura dovrebbe indagare. Intanto io cosa avevo trovato in letteratura e su cosa mi ero focalizzato? Su due lavori. Uno del professor Fauci, che alla fine dell'epidemia della prima SARS scrisse: l'uso dell'idrossiclorochina è stato fondamentale per sconfiggere la SARS e credo che sarà il game changer per le prossime epidemie di coronavirus. Lo sapevamo già. L'altro lavoro che mi sarebbe stato molto utile era un lavoro del professor Didier Raoult dell'Università di Marsiglia, che doveva essere qui, volevo ringraziarlo personalmente, spero che arrivi, e per ringraziare le persone. Il professor Raoult aveva testato con successo l'efficacia in vitro dell'associazione idrossiclorochina più azitromicina. Febbraio 2020, pochi giorni dopo quindi. Io mi offro all'Ordine dei Medici come medico volontario Covid-19. Una cosa normale per me, l'avevo fatto anche quando c'era stato nel 1980 un terremoto in Irpinia. Il 21 febbraio 2020, il primo caso ufficiale di Covid in Italia. Vi ricordo che i tamponi in Italia erano vietati a chi non proveniva da Wuhan. Nemmeno negli ospedali si potevano fare. E grazie a un medico, una donna coraggiosa, che fece il primo tampone violando le regole imposte dalle autorità sanitarie. Il paziente zero. 2 giorni prima, il Ministero della Salute, che aveva bloccato il campionato di calcio, permette, il 19 febbraio 2020, lo svolgimento della partita UEFA Champions League Atalanta-Valencia nello stadio di San Siro a Milano, da oltre 75.000 posti. L'Atalanta è la squadra di Bergamo, con molti tifosi in esodo da tutte le valli bergamasche, Val di Nembro compresa. La zona di Nembro diventerà l'epicentro dell'epidemia in Europa. Dico epidemia perché l'OMS ancora non l'aveva dichiarata pandemia. Lo farà l'11 marzo 2020, quasi un mese dopo. Il 1° marzo prendo servizio presso il Ministero della Salute per controlli aeroportuali, spesso salendo a bordo degli aeromobili. You can go next, please. Sia a Milano che a Linate. Come medico del Ministero segnalo ai miei superiori alcuni degli errori che il Ministero della Salute stava facendo e che erano davanti ai miei occhi evidenti. Bloccare i voli dalla Cina, senza controllare coloro che passavano da Zurigo o da Parigi o da Francoforte. I tamponi che erano utilizzati appunto solo ai ricoverati in ospedale, dopo il paziente zero. Il divieto delle autopsie, per preservare l'anatomopatologo che non aveva nessun senso, con un cadavere che non respira, essendo questo un virus respiratorio. La raccomandazione di disinfettare continuamente le mani, le superfici, gli ambienti, le ambulanze, o il divieto di condividere posate, piatti, bicchieri, quando il virus è respiratorio e soprattutto con una corona, da qui coronavirus, che è lipidica, è grassa, quindi viene denaturata dai succhi gastrici se ingerita e anche dal comune sapone. Bastava lavarsi le mani col sapone come abbiamo sempre fatto. E hanno guadagnato miliardi di euro e di dollari con i disinfettanti nel mondo. Non da ultimo, il divieto di fermare per controllo sanitario chiunque avesse la temperatura corporea sotto i 37 gradi Celsius. I passeggeri, anche davanti a noi, lo facevano in aereo, ma lo facevano anche mentre aspettavano il loro turno, si passavano il paracetamolo per essere sicuri di passare i blocchi. Cosa a me è segnalata più volte. Segui le regole. Bene, la sera dell'8 marzo 2020 viene dichiarata la zona rossa nel nord Italia, senza che il Ministero degli Interni, o quello della Difesa, avesse predisposti posti di blocco, che saranno istituiti solo 72 ore dopo. Centinaia di migliaia di persone dal nord sono scappati al sud, assaltando i treni e invadendo le autostrade. La risposta era sempre quella: devi seguire i protocolli senza discutere. Ma soprattutto non era mai successo, come ha detto il professor Isidoro, che non si curasse, nella storia della medicina, che non si curasse una malattia, che si attendesse che diventasse grave, e soprattutto dando il paracetamolo, che abbassa, come è noto, i livelli di glutatione, che è una molecola prodotta dal nostro organismo, dal nostro fegato, e che serve al sistema immunitario, è essenziale. 13 marzo 2020. Un medico coraggioso di Bergamo, Andrea Gianatti, decide di violare i protocolli che vietavano le autopsie e racconta al mondo che le persone morivano per la formazione di microtrombi, come ha detto il professor Isidoro, dovuti all'infiammazione dell'endotelio dei piccoli vasi. L'ossigeno non poteva più passare dall'aria dei polmoni ai globuli rossi, rendendo inefficace la ventilazione con CPAP o con l'intubazione. 16 marzo, attenzione, un sostegno quando la saturazione era molto bassa, normale, in aria, cioè voglio dire, a pressione normale ci stava, ma dovevi curarli nel frattempo. 16 marzo 2020, dopo una settimana di lockdown, con una Milano totalmente deserta e silenziosa, a parte le continue e assordanti sirene di ambulanze che rompevano il silenzio assoluto della città, e le immagini televisive che forse avete anche voi visto, toccanti, delle colonne di camion militari che portavano fuori da Bergamo decine di bare per farle cremare in altre città perché non c'era più posto a Bergamo, al cimitero o nel crematorio. Quel giorno ricevo la telefonata disperata di un collega, ma soprattutto di un amico. Papà sta morendo, il suo medico non risponde da giorni al telefono, ha 90 anni, ha febbre alta da giorni, non mangia e non beve, ha la saturazione bassissima. Gli ho dato una piccola bombola di ossigeno, ma vedo che non reagisce più agli stimoli. Attraverso la città deserta girando 13 farmacie per riuscire a trovare ciò che cercavo. Antinfiammatori, non certo paracetamolo, che da sempre si usano per arginare le infezioni, in qualsiasi tipo di infezione. Azitromicina e idrossiclorochina, ancora grazie al professor Raul. Cortisone, perché già si iniziava a parlare di tempesta citochinica, cioè di una reazione immunitaria anomala ed eccessiva, che alcuni soggetti che evidentemente sono predisposti geneticamente, tipo HLA0401, avevano, soprattutto se poi obesi, se anziani. Enoxieparina, perché appunto c'era già stata l'autopsia, e una bombola di ossigeno più grande. La polizia mi ferma, dato il lockdown, e io con le lacrime agli occhi, temendo di arrivare troppo tardi, dico loro: aiutatemi a salvare la vita, vi prego. Forse erano angeli, mi hanno scortato facendomi passare tutti gli incroci col rosso. Arrivai in tempo, era ancora vivo, ma vi giuro su mio figlio, che è qui davanti a me, che quando vidi quell'uomo pensai che non avrebbe superato la notte. Se ciò fosse successo, se quell'uomo fosse morto, sarebbe stato il mio primo e ultimo paziente Covid. Di questo sono certo. Io mi sarei sentito in colpa per non essere riuscito a salvarlo, mi sarei detto: è peccato di orgoglio, solo per il tuo 110 lode la laurea o per i 30 lode degli esami di malattie infettive e malattie infettive tropicali e sottropicali, o per i soli 2 anni di specialità in igiene, medicina preventiva ed epidemiologia. Alla fine sei solo un ortognato odontista, non fai più il medico da 40 anni. Tutto il mondo cerca una cura e tu credevi di averla trovata, vergognati. Invece, dopo solo 2 giorni, il paziente aveva abbandonato l'ossigeno e si aggirava per casa in pigiama. Dopo altri 2 giorni lo trovai in giacca e cravatta che discuteva col figlio perché non gli permetteva di andare a fare una passeggiata primaverile nel parco. Non sapeva e non aveva capito che c'era un lockdown. Provai a gridarlo al mondo e ai colleghi, e all'ordine dei medici, e al professor Burioni: c'è una possibilità di cura, ma non mi ascoltarono. Io credo veramente che sia stata la mano di Dio a guidarmi, a mostrarmi la strada, a farmi diventare uno dei suoi guerrieri di luce, come ci definiamo spesso tra di noi che abbiamo curato o che curiamo. E dopo aver curato e guarito un centinaio di pazienti anziani, già in piena tempesta citochinica, mi ricordai delle parole che mi aveva rivolto un santo, Papa Giovanni Paolo II, che in un'udienza straordinaria nel 1989, quando io lo ringraziai per aver fatto cadere il muro di Berlino, mi rispose con accento polacco, stringendomi la mano con entrambe le sue: no, sono io che ringrazio lei. Lei aiuta la gente che soffre. La capii solo tanti anni dopo quella frase. Fine aprile 2020 stavano istituendo un reparto Covid in un piccolo ospedale sopra il Lago Maggiore. Non c'erano più posti letto in Italia, ma non trovavano un medico che volesse gestirlo. Erano morti già oltre 100 medici italiani di Covid in quel periodo. Io andai, ero l'unico medico del reparto, ma con infermiere e OS fantastiche, che con la loro esperienza colmavano le mie carenze, soprattutto con i molti diabetici o cardiopatici. All right, thank you. Mi sentivo con il dottor Manson, il medico lotta contro le credenze dei baroni della medicina, ovvero Starr, nel romanzo di Cronin, E le stelle stanno a guardare. Vivevo in una tuta di biocontenimento, ma col mio nome Andrea scritto col pennarello. Can you go further, please? Perché a differenza di quanto andavo a casa dei pazienti, essi non mi potevano guardare in viso e non potevano riconoscermi e chiamarmi per nome, affidandosi a me, provando fiducia nel medico e nelle sue cure, poiché erano tutti terrorizzati e sicuri di morire. Avevo 41 letti e man mano che se ne liberava uno, subito arrivava un nuovo paziente. L'età media era sopra gli 80 anni, quasi tutti sotto ossigeno, praticamente tutti con varie ecopatologie, terapia guida, a parte piccole differenze individuali e specifiche, sempre antinfiammatori, antibiotico, idrossiclorochina, cortisone e enoxieparina. All'epoca si potevano considerare guariti solo con almeno 2 tamponi negativi eseguiti a 3 giorni di distanza e con la conferma di una RX polmonare che non presentasse più aspetti a vetro smerigliato. Li abbiamo guariti tutti. Tanto che a metà giugno 2020 chiusero il reparto. La curva dei contagi in Italia ai primi di giugno 2020 stava scendendo, sino quasi ad azzerarsi, e stava arrivando l'estate. Ma il 6 giugno 2020, per decreto, vengono riaperte le frontiere, che erano state chiuse, per i voli provenienti dal sud-est asiatico e Medio Oriente. Ogni giorno arrivavano aerei con anche 300 passeggeri a bordo, più voli al giorno, provenienti dall'Asia, quasi tutti lavoratori extracomunitari che tornavano in Italia per ricominciare a lavorare, a guadagnarsi il pane e che nonostante l'obbligo di quarantena era prevedibile che avrebbero dormito in 4, 5, 6 in una stanza, andando a lavare i piatti nei ristoranti il giorno dopo o a vendere le rose per strada il giorno dopo. Prendevano il paracetamolo davanti a noi in coda, stavano anche 3 ore in coda, e pur riconoscendo a distanza i sintomi, ci era vietato fermarli se la temperatura era sotto i 37 gradi e mezzo. Erano quelli i protocolli. La curva risalì ovviamente e mesi di restrizione e lockdown, socialmente, psicologicamente ed economicamente costosissimi, furono buttati al vento. Probabilmente deliberatamente, bisognava tenere alta l'arma della paura. Bisognava far resistere la pandemia sino al dicembre 2020. Vorrei solo focalizzarvi su alcuni punti. È una cosa importante, dirimente. Can you go further to the last slide? You know, yeah, again, more. That one. Queste linee guida sono del 27 marzo 2020, fatte dall'azienda sanitaria locale, quindi dall'ospedale Papa Giovanni XXIII, il primo colpito in Italia e quindi forse in Europa. 27 marzo 2020 pubblica le sue linee guida: azitromicina e idrossiclorochina a casa. Poi, se Covid serio, ricovero, magari cortisone e enoxaparina. Sapevamo già tutto il 27 marzo 2020. Le terapie erano giuste già nel marzo 2020. Avevamo avuto solo 600 morti in Italia fino ad allora. Degli altri 190.000 morti italiani, la responsabilità è di chi ha ignorato le terapie precoci domiciliari e il plasma iperimmune del dottor De Donno. Sapendo che l'autorizzazione dei vaccini a RNA messaggero sarebbe stata condizionata in emergenza al fatto che non esistessero le cure, altrimenti non avrebbero potuto autorizzarli. Il più grande business della storia occidentale, la più grande mistificazione che un giorno, presto o tardi, sarà considerato non solo il più grande scandalo dell'era moderna, ma il più grande genocidio del secolo, poiché oltre alle cure negate, con la criminalizzazione di idrossiclorochina e ivermectina e la complicità del mainstream e delle riviste scientifiche, alcuni potenti hanno sfruttato la paura e causato perdite infinite, pur sapendo che, e concludo, il Covid si cura con terapie domiciliari precoci, semplici e poco costose. I vaccini quindi sono inutili, esistendo le cure. I vaccini sono inefficaci, non prevenendo contagio e malattia, visto che tutti i virus a RNA messaggero mutano continuamente e lo sappiamo da sempre. I vaccini sono dannosi e in moltissimi casi di eventi avversi, oltre che evidenti e preoccupanti, saranno la sfida della medicina dei prossimi decenni. Questo Parlamento europeo, che ringrazio per l'invito, non può e non potrà non tenerne conto, o la storia lo condannerà. Grazie.
Yeah.
Okay, let's go back to work. Good morning, everyone. I'm Dr. Louis Fouché, and I'm intensivist in Marseille. I should speak in French normally, but I think maybe our French translator has COVID, so I'm going to try in English, and you may forgive my accent and my poor English if I mess up. So I work in Marseille, and I'm speaking for myself, and also I'm contributing to the Independent Scientific Council, and I work on this presentation with the independent scientists of reupload, which is a group that we created, which is free from any conflict of interest. And that's the case for myself. I have 57 euros notified on Transparence Santé, which is the transparency database registering the conflict of interest in France with drug industry, vaccine industry. I don't have any stock option in any numeric firm or assurential prudential company. And I speak under the law of the 4th of March in France, which pushes us to give a clear, loyal, and information grounded on clean science and on clinical experience and also common sense. And, you know, I'm sued in France for what I'm going to tell you. So I just recall that law. It's important. It's also in the deontologic code, medical code. So I'm going to deal with masks and lockdown again. You already told a little bit about that, but trying to keep a cool temper over those political decisions and what we call non-pharmaceutical intervention that have been done. It's my job to keep calm when everything is going wrong, and so we're going to try to do that. Slide, please. And we're going to try and weigh the benefit and the risk, because any sanitary or medical decision should weigh the risk and the benefit and then take a decision under the uncertainty. And you're always under uncertainty, but you have to make a decision, bearing the consequences. And that's what we call consequential ethical. One of the points to keep a clear mind is to have an historical context which is clear, and to also avoid being blurred and disorientated in space and time. So I just recall a few historical landmark and plots. In 2020 in France, we identified in January this novel coronavirus, and then between March and May, we had the first lockdown for 55 days, and it was compulsory for us to fill in an auto-attestation to have the right to go out. You know, we were giving ourselves an attestation to have the right to go out. And the mask got mandated in public transportation in May 2020. And then in July 2020, the mask was mandated in enclosed spaces and public places at the same time. And during the time of the summer, in August, the mask wearing was mandated in the streets of any city. And then in September, the mask was mandated in workplace and also in schools. And then in November, for children after 5 years old in any school. And we got a second lockdown for 45 days between October and the end of October and December 2020. And then another lockdown in 2021 between April and May for 1 month. Slide, please. How can we make a decision over this point of the mask? We have the institutional position that were up to date before. And so before 2020, there was no doubt for the WHO that the mask in general population was of no utility. You have about 120 different trials showing that there's no utility at all. And it was also questioned in the surgery room, you know. So if it's not sure if it's efficient in a surgery room, it's surely not in the street for a general population. Next slide, please. you have another source of information. You have institution, you have the past science, but you have also what the firm and the manufacturer of the pattern are saying. And all the manufacturers of masks and surgical masks noted on the boxes of the mask that it was not providing any protection against coronavirus. So this is just a big point. If you don't follow what the manufacturers say, this is kind of insanity. Next slide, please. There was an interesting study in the British Medical Journal in 2002, secondarily to a Red Cross work in Guantanamo, showing that the prisoner treatment was bordering torture. And I gave you a picture of those prisoners. They have masks. They have masks and they are insulated. They have sensorial privation. It became the normality in 2020 for the COVID pandemic, and the new normality for children in Thailand who were insulated in the school, just like you can see. And this psychological treatment has big sequela. We can see there in the Spanish translator that they're traumatized and they're still wearing a mask in 2023, which is no sense. Next slide, please. Michael Ryan, who is the team leader for the containment of the epidemic, stated that there was no evidence to suggest that the wearing of masks in the entire population was beneficial in any way. And he said that in March 2020. And in fact, he said, and I quote, "There is some evidence to the contrary. And due to the improper wearing of the mask and you touching everywhere and giving and transmitting the epidemic and the contagion by the manuportage." In April 2020, there was no evidence neither that the use of the mask by healthy people in public spaces, even generals, could prevent any respiratory virus, including the coronavirus. Today, the masks are recommended following a recent exposure to COVID-19, or for somebody who if you had contact with somebody suspect of COVID-19. And still, when you go in the metro or in the train in France or in Belgium, you are recommended to wear a mask. We're going to see if there is science about that. Next slide, please. The European CDC in February 2020 said a conclusion. There is the evidence for effectiveness of non-medical intervention and medical mask wearing by the general public is non-existent or very weak. The Norwegian Institute of Public Health said at the same time that there's no evidence that medical and non-medical masks are effective in preventing transmission in the general population. They compute and calculate how many persons should wear a mask to prevent from one infection. And they compute that they needed 200,000 people who would need to wear a mask to prevent one single new infection per week. The number to treat is just insane. Next slide, please. We have science about that, and there's a big meta-analysis made by the Cochrane Library, and which is usually cited by Jefferson and Alter, which got interested into the physical intervention to interrupt or reduce the spread of the respiratory virus. And it first got interested into the medical and surgical mask, and comparing to no mask. And about 18 randomized control trials have been pulled, and said there was no effect, no relative effect. It was not significant. So there's no effect of surgical mask on preventing respiratory illness. Next slide, please. They got interested into comparing the N95 or FFP2 respirator, which has the duck mask that you can see. They pulled 13 or 14 RCT, randomized control trial, and no relative effect was shown on that. No difference between respirators and the other mask or no mask. Next slide, please. So they conclude that the mask would be a symbol for the society. Maybe you're protected and you think so, but the evidence says you may not be. Thank you. Next slide. there was an interesting study called Denmask, and that you may have heard about, which took place in Danish and in Denmark, and it was a randomized controlled trial enrolling 6,000 adults in 2 groups, mask or no mask, and the primary outcome would be the SARS-CoV-2 infection and what months by PCR or antibody testing or an hospital diagnosis. And the result was there was 1.8% of infection and 2.1% of infection between mask wearer and non-mask wearer. So there was no statistical significant evidence that mask wearing should prevent from SARS-CoV-2 infection. That's the major impact in science. Thank you. Next slide. I'm a side the opposite, you know. Otherwise, I would be taxed of cherry picking. And there was a study made in Bangladesh, and which is usually cited by the governments and the media as a proof of the mask utility, and which showed that there would be a relative efficiency of 11% reduction between the people who wear the mask and the people who don't on the COVID symptoms. That's the boxes you can see on the left, and on the symptomatic seropositivity, relative efficacy of 9%. What is it? Relative efficacy. Because this is kind of a trick, a trap. You must count, if you have 2% infected over 100 and you got to 1 over 100 in the other group, you have 50% relative efficacy. But absolute efficacy would be 1%. Okay? So what is the absolute efficacy in those groups? The absolute efficacy is that you need 104% to spare 1 COVID symptom. And in the second main point, which is symptomatic seropositivity, you would need to mask 1,200% to avoid 1 COVID seropositivity. So this is what concludes the science when it's on the opposite. Thank you. Next slide. There was a nearly experimental nested study in a court in Catalonia in Spain, because they did some test and PCR in every single child they found between 3 and 11 attending school. So it was nearly a experimental study, you know, and it was 600,000 children that were tested like that. So that's a big cohort. And between mask and non-mask, the attack rate of the infection was 4.3% and 4.6%. There was no difference, concluding that the mask mandate in school was perfectly ineffective. Thank you. You can come to the next slide. So that's about the children, because it was a big subject and it made a lot of us react when they masked the children. Even our dear Anthony Fauci concluded like 2 weeks ago, in the end of April, that from a broad public health standpoint, at the population level, masks work at the margin, maybe 10%. Even him says that. You can switch to next slide, please. So. There's also some risk, you know, and the risks are important. You have several studies trying to find if the capnid, meaning the CO2 in the blood, is increasing when you're under the mask, and it does, 7.4% of increase in 2 studies in Medium. And so this has been reported by the WHO. Okay, I'm getting to the end. Thank you. Can you pass to next? There are also graphene-contaminated masks, and the ANSES, which is our national agency for security of the different medication, said that, and even a very single intratracheal installation in mask, it persists for 28 days, and it goes in liver and spleen, meaning that it goes through the bloodstream. So it shouldn't be there, but it has been distributed to the healthcare workers, though. You can pass. Okay, you can pass, thank you, but we can find some fungi in the different mask when it's used, and so you can auto-contaminate yourself with that. This is about lockdown. I'm just going to tell you something that maybe interests you. We use usually an epidemiologic model called SIR, meaning that you have susceptible people of infection, and then infected people, and then recovered people. And we got two different diffusion parameter called beta and gamma. And beta over gamma is called R0, that you heard about so many times. And beta is the diffusion rate, meaning the speed of diffusion of the infection. And we compared the beta between different countries. We modelized that. You can go to the next one, in Europe. And you can see that these are the curves of the infection for COVID mortality with our world in data. And we fit that model over the curve that we have, and it was perfectly fitting, you know. So the prediction, the mathematical prediction, is perfect. And we compared the beta between the different groups and the different countries. You can get to the other one. It was around 0.25. Thank you. You can switch slide, please. It was 0.25 in nearly every country except one, Sweden. Guess why? Guess why? Very homogeneous. So the mathematics proves that the lockdown have increased the speed of virus diffusion by 50% compared to the Sweden. It was faster when you locked down. We're getting to the end. Thank you. I'm concluding. Can you get to the end? But there was a lot of evidence for secondary effect of the lockdown also. It's been raised in a very good article by Ioannidis about mass formation into the population, the drift toward inequalities and harsh inequalities, socially, economically, and sanitarily speaking. So, as a conclusion, in 2020, there was no evidence of benefits of mask wearing in general population. In 2023, that's the same. There's still no evidence of benefits after 3 years of mask mandates, and there is a significant risk for children in wearing this mask. The lockdowns is a failure in slowing the epidemic spread, and the mathematics is showing it. The lockdown bear major risk for social and societal inequalities and mass formation risk. So finally, you can conclude, and we make a consensus conference over that and say, great A for everything. Lockdown must be avoided. Mask mandate in general population and children must be avoided. Thank you.
Well, I'm not Didier Raoult, if you... But we will do the same talk, so that's the reason I'm here. Slide, please. Well, I would like first to thank the organizer and here the member of the parliament to allow us to report our experience in EHU Mediterranean Infection, which is a referral center for preparedness of the pandemics in Marseille, South France. Next slide, please. So who are we? We have won 142 million euro national grant in 2011. for build a big center of 27,000 meters square with 1,500 meters square bio-level security-free laboratory to grow and work on very highly pathogenic microorganisms. We have probably the best equipped laboratory. More than €4 million of equipment have been provided essentially by Europe, by FIDER. We have 75 beds, and which 25 are in BSL-free level. And we are a referral center for South France for preparedness of epidemics. We have 150 employees, more than 100 researchers, more than 100 students coming from the south, essentially. And we have 9 highly cited researchers. In France, there is 140 highly researchers. And we are publishing more than 6,000 articles in the Web of Science since 2011. So we know science. We are researchers. Next slide, please. Next. I just introduced the COVID epidemics at ESU and our input in the knowledge of this epidemic. Next slide, please. What we did during the epidemics, we made tests for more than 3,000 people. We made cultivation of the virus for more than 10,000 viruses. We care for more than 30,000 people, outpatients, and for more than 5,000 patients in hospital. So we have a great experience of COVID, and I will show you what we have done. Next slide, please. We were the first in France, and probably very, very early, to decide in this pandemic to test, detect, isolate, and manage and treat the patient. And we were the first in France to test, and we developed tests for the COVID, and we never refused any one test to every person who just came to be tested in our institutes. Next. We did 1,000 PCR and 1,000 genomic studies for the different variants. We were the first that say there is not one pandemic, there is several pandemics with several variants all over the world. This is a slide that collects the whole pandemic from the very early first in gray, the Wuhan genome, and the other genomes. Next slide, please. We describe the way the pandemics progress in Europe, especially in one genome we call Marseille 4, which was suspected to be a genome coming from Denmark and was not. This was a genome, the epidemic take place in the northern of France and diffuse in all Europe before diffusing in all the world. So we know exactly what happened with this pandemic by its genomic study. The next slide, please. We have we get a good use of cultivating virus because since years we are cultivating intracellular bugs, and we cultivate regularly measles, herpes virus, influenza virus, and we cultivate SARS-CoV many times. We recover SARS-CoV from saliva, stools, bronchoalveolar fluids, nasopharyngeal samples, skins. Next slide, please. We also describe the correlation between the PCR viral load and the survival of the virus in the different area of the body. And so showing that when the PCR is beginning to slow down, the virus was dead. Next slide, please. Going to the chloroquine crisis, what happened in ESU? Next slide, please. Very simple. We are doctors. We knew very early that the Chinese have tested chloroquine on the first patient. We were very used with chloroquine because we treat Q fever, Whipple disease, and other diseases that we are expert in with chloroquine. We are tropicalists. And we know that chloroquine was very, very, very safe medicine with absolutely no problem since many years. So we decided, see, well, we have a very safe treatment. We have some proof that works in China. Is there some in vitro experiments? Yes, that was in vitro experiments and several in vitro experiments that showed that chloroquine was working on the virus SARS-CoV that we cultivate in our laboratory. And so we decide something very easy. No risk, even no effects. We just try to do it. And we start by that in doing a very small study. Next slide, please. On 24 patients versus 24 not treated patients. And we did not just look at the survival, we just look at the viral load. And it works. It works slightly. On 24 patients, it works well nicely. We just decided not to do randomized because that was not ethical. When you are giving a drug that you know that works, versus no drugs, this is not ethical. So we were asked to do randomized study, and we said, no, we won't never do a randomized study. We will do observatory study, because it's this kind of study that is very easy to do, very fast, and it can give some data, very proven data. So we did that on observatory on 1,000 and thousands patients. So, next slide, please. And we try to discuss the fact that randomized studies are not used and usable in epidemics because it's too long, it's too expensive, and is a very inconvenient problem, which we call a symptom paradox. Next slide, please. So we did the last work very recently, not yet published, on more than 1,000 patients that confirm, next slide, please, that, next slide, that hydroxychloroquine regimen is much more powerful than no hydroxychloroquine regimen on the clearance of viral loads in these patients. So we know that works. Next slide, please. So we went to the last study that was proposed for publication with 30,000 patients. It is the biggest study in the world. We treat 30,000 patients with hydroxychloroquine. And we show once again that hydroxychloroquine works better than no treatments. We were said that we are lying, the database was wrong, the data was so for that we give the data, all the database is available free for everybody in this room. If they want to remake the study, they can do it. Next slide, please. Next slide. Well, just come back one after previous one. Why is so big pressure on this treatment by hydroxychloroquine? Just imagine, in patients aged from 60 to 89 years, the mortality reduction is 75%. There is an estimated 4,070 people that have been infected among elderly people living in nursing home in France, and 26% died, which is 1,025,000. If we have treated them, we would save them for 100,000 people. So this is the reason that this is very important. Next slide, please. Vaccines for acute respiratory infection are not efficient on virus spread. Everybody knows that now. Next slide. Just three slides. This is picked up on Hopkins sites. The red is the positive case, the white, the died, and the green, the vaccine. You see that the epidemics is more important after vaccination. This is the world. Next slide. This is the US, exactly the same. Next slide. And this is France. This is exactly the same. So that just means that vaccine has no effect on the pandemic. Next slide. COVID-19 conflict of interest, politicization, corruption, and suppression of science, cyber harassments. That's what we have lived since 3 years. Just an example for that. This is what you can find on YouTube. Read that. This is very important. You are not allowed to publish anything on YouTube that is contrary to the truth. You are not allowed to do that. This is something that I never imagined in my life. Next slide. And this is perfect. If ivermectin is just for animals, that's what the FDA say. This is for animals. Well, million miles of pills have been used for treating parasitosis in all over the world. This is lying. Next slide. This is a paper that we try to publish. There is no such thing as a Ministry of Truth. We are living the George Orwell story right now. Next slide, please. Cyber harassment. You know what is PubPeer? Well, it's something very, very, very nice. It's a platform where every people can just criticize science. You can criticize science. You just access to a paper, and you read the paper, and you say you agree, you are not agree. But this is not, I mean, science can be criticized by experts in science, some people that know what is science. And so you have anonymous people, because you can be anonymous people that criticize papers. Next slide, please. This is an example. You pick up a paper, you have an anonymous number. This is a fungi, okay, and you say what you want to say. We have been harassed during 2 years with that, with hundreds and hundreds of comments on this, and that was at the origin of all the investigation that have been made by the French organisms. So this is something that is very important and needs to be think. Can we allow some kind of platforms? Next slide, please. The success of ESU, which makes so many jealous, opposes too much criticism and arouses so much hatred, is simply linked to the fact that we saw the patient, we quickly diagnose and treat them with that seemed to us the most effective and the least toxic treatment based on scientific data by surrounding itself with caution and without waiting an improbable randomized trial. We were right to do so, at least for the hundreds of patients whose lives were saved. If necessary, we will do it again.
So thank you. I appreciate the invitation. I'm going to speak about a topic. I don't think any of the topics today are pleasant, but this one is particularly unpleasant to me. I'm going to talk about the global war on ivermectin, which was a massive global disinformation campaign whose only objective is to suppress the evidence of efficacy of this life-saving drug. My colleague, Dr. Brucki, just referred to the war on hydroxychloroquine. I'm going to take you through almost like a case study. This is what they do. And keep in mind, what I'm going to talk about, it has nothing to do with ivermectin. It has everything to do with a decades-long war. They've been doing these things for decades on any generic off-patent drug, which threatens their profits. Next slide. Keep in mind, this is a forest plot. There's a little gray line in the center. All the green triangles to the left of that gray line are medicines that have trials to show that they're effective in COVID. We have 43 effective therapies. You've heard of almost none of them. If you live in the United States, the only ones approved are the ones that are circled. They have something in common, which is they are all absurdly expensive and present massive profits to pharmaceutical companies. Any medicine, no matter how many studies, if it costs $1 or $2, it will not find regulatory approval in any advanced health economy around the world. And what happens as a result? People die. And they die frequently and in high numbers because there's a barrier to getting access to these medicines, having these recommended. If you see the square, that's ivermectin. It has the most studies of any therapy. 95 controlled trials, over 40 are randomized, and showing a massive evidence of efficacy. Next slide. Now, why would they attack ivermectin? Ivermectin probably, and hydroxychloroquine, I would consider them almost equal, presented a massive threat. It would have halted the vaccine campaign if they were following the rules, which is you can't have an effective therapy. It would have skyrocketed the public enemy number one, which is something called vaccine hesitancy, because this was all about the vaccine. And so they had to go after these drugs. It also threatens the profits of all of the therapeutics that they were rushing out and improving on manipulated, actually fraudulent studies of single studies by these companies. So if you're talking about remdesivir, Paxlovid, and molnupiravir, billion-dollar contracts were written by our government before those studies ever were published. There was press releases issued and contracts signed, and billions of dollars went into the pharmaceutical companies' hands. They could not have a competitor. Next slide. So how did they do this? Well, it's something called disinformation. And I'm going to be speaking specifically with the tactics that are used by industries when science emerges that's inconvenient to their interests. Every industry does this when science emerges that's inconvenient to their interests. There is no industry that is more skilled at this than the pharmaceutical industry in modern times, with the consolidation of media power, their control over social media, and their complete capture of regulatory health agencies across advanced health economies. What they can do is they can make you believe things that are true. They can make you believe things that it is false, and it can make you complicit in their own device, and it's largely centered around the use of propaganda and censorship, except their abilities to do both of those things are historically unparalleled. We now have a global media and communication system which allows them to do this propaganda and censorship worldwide. The biggest and the foundation of this entire disinformation campaign, I'm sorry to tell you, it occurred at the level of the studies that were done by big agencies. So the biggest and most funded studies were the most corrupt. And it was also occurred at the level of the highest impact medical journals in the world, as well as the world's leading health agencies, which you could consider, one of which is in the US. Next slide. Next slide. Keep in mind, they were scared of ivermectin from the beginning. My colleague, Dr. Robert Malone, and other researchers had already identified ivermectin as effective against at least a dozen RNA viruses before COVID began. They were worried about ivermectin and its antiviral properties, and when the Nobel Prize-winning discoverer asked Merck, his old partner, I think we should study ivermectin in COVID, what did Merck say? No, thank you. In the middle of a global pandemic. Next slide. Merck went even farther. And one night in February of 2021, when there was nothing to support these three statements, I will tell you this was their public relations team that put this on their website. Now, to find that a big pharmaceutical company would publish lies on their website is completely unsurprising to me. What was surprising is that this launched media campaigns around the world where media trumpeted over and over, started to echo a pharmaceutical company whose three statements completely are protecting their profits. And this became a PR campaign that went around the world. Merck says that ivermectin doesn't work. Next slide. So you could see this started early before there was any evidence to show that it didn't work. In fact, at the time of my testimony, which was 2 months prior to that statement, I already had 35 controlled trials, 17 of which were randomized controlled trials. There was already immense amount of evidence showing its efficacy. As of 2 weeks ago, we have 95 controlled trials with 134,000 patients. If you look at the forest plot to the side, all of the green squares that are going all the way to the left are showing large magnitude estimates of efficacy from dozens and dozens of trials. These are only the early treatment trials. It is the most proven medication in history. In history. Yet not one advanced health economy around the world recommends it. Almost all hospitals, it's been removed from their formularies. And if you try to get it filled at a pharmacy, any retail pharmacy in any of those developed countries, the pharmacists will not do it. They're scared to death. Next slide. The trials. So how come we have all of these big, rigorous, large, high-quality trials, right? There's actually only been 6 of them. So out of the 95 trials, I will tell you the only ones you've seen on the front pages of your newspapers are what I call the big 6. So out of that 95, there were 6 trials that were heavily funded and carried out by investigators. They're called the largest and high-quality trials. What did they show? They somehow concluded, in contradiction to all of the other trials, that ivermectin wasn't effective. How did they do that? They did it because they know how to do it and they've been doing it for a while. They can design trials to show you something works. They can design trials to show you something doesn't work. They pull the same tricks over and over and over again. And I will tell you, all you need to know about those 6 trials compared to the 95, with one exception, those were the only trials where almost every single investigator of that trial was drowning in pharmaceutical company financial conflicts of interest. Every other trial had no financial conflicts of interest. So you have to ask yourself why they reached conclusions that completely departed from the rest of the evidence base. Next slide. These are the big 6, and they appeared in the highest impact journals in the world: New England Journal of Medicine, the Journal of the American Medical Association, British Medical Journal, The Lancet, and the Annals of Internal Medicine. Every time they were published, they launched PR campaigns across the world. You saw radio stations and television stations and newspapers blaring, latest high-quality study shows that ivermectin doesn't work. And then there's lots of trials showing that the ivermectin advocates, of which I'm one, I will tell you every country in the world has experts on ivermectin who have had to watch and witness this propaganda campaign. Next slide. This is one of the more egregious samples. This is my own country. This is funded by the National Institutes of Health, which is our largest research funder. They just did a couple of trials on ivermectin in Active 6. Next slide. By the way, the lead investigator, Dr. Susanna Nagy, owns stock in a competitor to ivermectin. And she also has conflicts of interest with Gilead, which makes remdesivir, as well as other products that compete with ivermectin. Do you think that she's an objective investigator? And do you think it's an accident she was hired? It is not. She was hired on purpose to do this kind of stuff. And if you look at this trial was originally designed to look at the difference in symptoms at day 14, which would make sense for an acute viral illness. In the middle of the trial, mysteriously, they decided to change the endpoint from day 14 to day 28. Why would they do that? Well, if you look at the results that they found, if you look at the posterior P efficacy column in the other table, anything above 0.95 is a statistically significant result, which would show that ivermectin is superior. In the middle, you can see this in the journal. It's completely public knowledge. No one talks about it. Do you see now why they moved it from day 14 to day 28? It was to disappear the statistical significance. This paper was published in one of the top journals of the world with the conclusion that ivermectin has no role in the treatment of COVID. You know there's no major differences at day 28. And by the way, this is in all mild patients. Very few went to the hospital. There was one death, and that was in the ivermectin group. They never got ivermectin because they died beforehand. Next slide. I call it the big six because they were the big ones that were published in the highest impact journals, but it's really 7. Let's talk about this 7th one. It was started a long time ago by the University of Oxford, by the same investigator who did a 25,000 person trial on molnupiravir, which has been completed, and we know the results, which shows that molnupiravir doesn't work. But it's a little odd what happened to the ivermectin trial. It has been 10 months since the trial completed. Not one mention of the result. Does anyone find that anomalous or abnormal? When we had to hear results of remdesivir and Paxlovid and molnupiravir by press release before the data was available. These people at Oxford are sitting on a positive trial and you know it. They won't publish. They also did other stuff. Next slide. By the way, and if you look at the designs of, I'm sorry, if you go back one, if you look at how they're designed, this is so brazen, right? If they want to show something's effective, you're going to make sure you're going to get the study drug into that patient immediately and as early as possible to maximize benefit. So they did a median of 2 days in a 25,000 person molnupiravir trial, which is a fantastic achievement. I would love to see that kind of science being practiced everywhere. Problem was, the drug wasn't effective. What do they do with ivermectin? They allow up to 14 days to start the medicine. And we have evidence from some of the participants that they were totally well by the time they got their medicines. This is not a real trial. This is fake. But I think they weren't good enough at what they were doing because they're sitting on a positive result. There's no other explanation why 10 months have gone by and we haven't heard it. They are laying low, sitting quiet, because they've seen that a lot of us around the world have found all of the fraud and brazen manipulations in the other large trials. Next slide. They also did something else curious, which is in the middle of the trial, they suddenly announced the halting of the trial. And the trialist from Oxford literally claimed to the world that they ran out of ivermectin, which is so absurd. No self-respecting trialist would ever run out of a study drug in the middle. Funny thing is, there's one functioning journalist left in the world, and that was at the Epoch Times. And you know what they did? They actually did something called journalism. They called the pharmaceutical company that was supplying the ivermectin to Oxford, and they had one quick question. They said, hey, did you guys run out of ivermectin? What was their answer? No, we have plenty. This is the kind of stuff they're doing. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Beyond the publication, the selective publication of negative trials by pharmaceutical company conflicted researchers, I have in my book, which is soon to be published because I did a huge deep case study on this, I have numerous examples of researchers around the world with positive randomized controlled trials of ivermectin. They were uniformly and systematically rejected from publication from any journal in the first or second tier of medical journals, uniformly rejected. There is an editorial mafia that controls our top medical journals. Science has been completely corrupted. Beyond the rejections are those that actually managed to go through peer review and get published. We were suddenly retracted for reasons we'd never heard of in our careers. Me and my group, we published over 1,500 peer-reviewed articles, never had one retracted. First time in our lives was our ivermectin paper. Next slide. Next slide. And then we had to read editorial after editorial, propelling these narratives that circulate in the media relentlessly. Don't believe ivermectin science. The studies are all low quality, too small. In different countries, the doses aren't the same. It can't be believed. Wait for the real science. These are the narratives that they've used to try to destroy the evidence of efficacy. Next slide. Next slide. And this is an example. They picked one trial, and they supposedly found it to be fraudulent. It may or may not have been. There are fraudulent trials in any body of evidence. We all know it. It's about 20% of trials will be fraudulent. They are not unique to ivermectin. But the world's leading researcher, hired by the WHO and UNITAID, who published a phenomenally positive meta-analysis, which was a summary of 24 randomized controlled trials, which showed statistically significant improvements in mortality, hospitalization, time to clinical recovery, and time to viral clearance. I hadn't talked to him in a few months, and I saw that he published that paper, and I couldn't believe how astoundingly positive that paper was. I could believe by the fact that the media was silent about it. It was not carried. And then I think the other side got real worried, because I'm going to stop in a second. The other side got real worried because Andy started behaving very differently. He self-retracted his own paper, next slide, and he started removing randomized controlled trials using invented categories. This is from his exact paper. It looks like a 5-year-old who's trying to disappear the evidence of efficacy. So he makes up these categories, potentially fraudulent, no definition of what kind of study that is. And then this other category, which is some concerns. So there's a category of evidence in the which is when Dr. Andrew Hill has some concerns. So he removes and disappears the evidence base to the point where it loses statistical significance, and now he's claiming it doesn't work. A little bit bizarre of a turnaround for this researcher. Next slide, and I'm going to finish. The agencies which we know they control, you cannot work at a health agency without making pharma happy. You know your career is over, you're off of committees, you don't graduate from the agencies to get jobs in pharmaceutical unless you do their bidding. They are completely in lockstep. And I will tell you that what happened was, with the ivermectin story in the United States, is that in the middle of August of 2021, ivermectin prescriptions hit 90,000 a week. They were skyrocketing. Everyone was figuring out it was working. Everybody was prescribing. In a very short sequence, you saw our CDC send out a memo to every state Department of Health, which then went to every licensed physician in that state. And that memo said, careful of ivermectin, we're seeing overdoses and people are getting injured. They made it out to be a dangerous drug when it's one of the safest, if not the safest medication we have in history. And after that, where they said that it was dangerous, all of the professional societies in the United States with no authority sent out memos to every doctor in the country. We call for an immediate cessation of prescribing of ivermectin. And what happened then is the horse dewormer PR campaign was launched. And you can tell a PR campaign in a narrative when it's 2 weeks, 4 different channels, and that's what you saw. You saw late night talk show hosts, newspapers, magazines, radio, horse dewormer, horse dewormer, horse dewormer. And at the end of those 2 weeks, no self-respecting doctor would ever prescribe such a dangerous and ineffective drug, and no patient would want to get it. Do you think that PR campaign was invented in August of 2021? It was not. It was launched in 2021 because they saw they were losing this war against ivermectin. And here we are, at the end of 3 years, and it's been shut down in most of the advanced health economies around the world, one of the most effective drugs in history that would have saved millions of lives. This was a humanitarian catastrophe and a crime against humanity, yet no one will go to jail for it.
Before I begin, I would like to thank the organizers. It's a pleasure talking with you today. I'll just wait for the first slide. My presentation today is media over medicine, and an important question to ask here is, was our COVID response based on clinical virology or behavioral psychology? A very important question to ask. Next slide. Some more important questions rotate around, does media have the power to make our decisions for us? Can group pressure, our fear of the crowd, force us to make illogical decisions? Was the public exposed to any group pressure psychology during the COVID response? Next slide. The next slide was a video exposing the power of group pressure. It was called the ASH Group Conformity Experiment. The video was supposed to demonstrate this experiment to you, and I'm going to have to do it live right now because I have no video. It rotated around this particular piece of paper. I'm going to do it with Dr. Stephen Malthouse. Stephen, there's a line on the right, and you have to match it the same length to one of the three lines. What's the right answer, A, B, or C? A. A, you're correct. And it was done in research groups of 6, but there were 5 actors who were instructed to give the wrong answer, to see if giving the wrong answer would pressure the research subject to give the wrong answer. Next slide. And the results were dramatic. 50% of people conformed to the crowd and gave the wrong answer. Secret answers given on paper reduced the conformity to only 12%. Only 25% of people held their ground to what they knew was true, right, and just like the honorable members here today that stood their ground. Most conformists willingly admitted that their answers were wrong, but they went along with the crowd anyway. And how much of that have we seen since March 2020? People who are most likely to conform were low status, high need for approval types. I think we're going to the next slide. Sorry, I skipped ahead. There we go. People who were most likely to conform were low status, high need for approval types. We call them the forever children in psychology. People from cultures who honor obedience, and people who derive their self-worth by how well they obey authority. Next slide. There are other conformity factors. If a person is in fear, they conform more. The conformist portion of our nervous system is our limbic system. This is our fight or flight system that responds to fear. Fear shuts down critical thinking and increases conformist behavior. Has anybody seen any fear since March of 2020? Next slide. Psychology experts explain how to best control the public. Dr. Juice Merleau, author of the book Rape of the Mind and the Psychology of Thought Control, recounted that keeping a victim confused is the best for psychological control and manipulation of the public. Dr. Merleau also recounted that with the training of any animal, it's best to train the human animal in isolation, away from others. Did anybody notice any isolation from March 2020 forward? Merleau further recounted, after studying Korean War POWs, that mind controlling a person was best served with periods of intense attack and fear, broken up by periods of peace and favored treatment. Confusion, again, to control the public. Next slide. Edward Bernays, author of the book Propaganda and Crystallizing Public Opinion, explained that the crowd wasn't even needed physically to build the group pressure that changed the victim's mind. Sitting in a room alone and only perceiving the power of an imaginary group can indeed bring about conformity to that imaginary group. Next slide. What role does fear play in psychological control or manipulation? Well, Stockholm Syndrome was a phrase coined by psychiatrist Nils Bergerath after a 5-day bank robbery standoff in Stockholm, Sweden. Many bank tellers taken hostage became sympathetic to their captors and even romantically involved under the immense trauma, fear, and stress. Demonstrations of immense public power, sometimes by the government, can trigger a survival response of trauma bonding with the abuser and endorsing the abuser for fear of reprisal. And did we see any of this trauma bonding amongst government officials from March 2020 forward? Next slide. Was psychology used against the public during COVID? Organizations like the UK's SAGE, the Safety Advisory Group for Emergencies, and the International BIT Corporation, BIT standing for Behavioral Insights Team, admitted openly to using nudge-style psychological manipulation on the public during COVID in order to achieve their desired outcomes. We were isolated and trained effectively in that isolation, as Dr. Malou described. Fear was upregulated into the stratosphere in order to lower IQ and increase conformist behaviors inside the limbic system via the fear response. Next slide. When the human animals, us, were getting trained in COVID isolation, the opinion of the perceived crowd was repetitively imprinted into us by the media, thus leading to behavior and belief-altering group compliance, as Ash had demonstrated, but without the group being physically present, as Bernays had cited. The public were kept in perpetual states of confusion with contradictory messages. We all know those contradictory messages. Gyms had to close during a health crisis, but the bottle shops were open. At first, no masks were necessary. And then one, and then two, and then no mask if you took the vaccination, and then masks back on for everybody regardless of vaccination status. Then all of a sudden, masks didn't matter. The virus had a pocket watch. It would attack at 10 and not 9:59 during the curfews. And it had a tape measure at the restaurants, the virus did. It would attack you if you were standing, going to the bathroom, and it would not attack you if you were sitting. And that poses the question of what happens to someone if they enter a restaurant in a wheelchair. And if you are confused, you were meant to be confused, because confusion is the base of all effective mind control, brainwashing, and behavior modification. Next slide. Then came the public exposure, very important, of people's vaccine status with the work mandates triggering ASH's 50% or higher compliance to group pressure, compared to the 12% compliance level if our decisions were kept to ourselves. They exposed your vaccine status, knowing of the ASH conformity experiment, knowing you would comply more. That's why they did it. The cycling of terror and more normal periods of peace and favored treatment were relentless, which kept the human psyche in a permanent state of instability, optimal for controlling the masses, according to Dr. Juice Merleau. Next slide. Were authorities instructed to be heavy-handed with the public in order to trigger this trauma bonding with authority? Were they instructed to do this to facilitate Stockholm Syndrome and increase compliance? This is Canadian pastor Artur Pawlowski getting arrested multiple times for feeding the poor against COVID restriction policy. Next slide. So the question is, again, was our COVID response based on and driven by clinical virology or behavioral psychology? Crimes were committed here. You cannot weaponize psychology against the public. Criminal charges needs to be laid. Thank you very much. My name is Jason Christoph. 9 minutes.
Hello, everybody. Can I have your attention, please? We don't have the video to start the next session, so I'm just going to begin my presentation. So if everybody could just pay attention, thank you. Okay, so it's really my privilege and pleasure to be here today. And I just want to point out, I have served as an expert witness in quite a few court cases, and I take my scientific testimony very seriously, and this will be no different. And so I am imposing upon myself a swearing-in moment here. So I brought my Bible, and on this Bible I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help me God. I base all of my messaging on peer-reviewed, published science. I often get accused of spreading misinformation. For those who do that, they often attack me as a person. I never attack anybody as a person. I feel that we're all of equal inherent value as human beings. We're all deserving of respect and love, and that applies to those who hate me. But I do often point out errors in people's messaging when I feel that it contradicts the science. And what I want to show you today is a lot of errors in the messaging regarding COVID-19 vaccines. So if I could have the next slide, please. So first of all, and I'm going to use the screen to my left to point things out. So for full disclosure, I'm the Chief Operating Officer for a company called Immunoceutica, which develops immunoceuticals. I also hold some research funding that was provided to me by my federal government to study host immune responses to viruses. I hold several patents related to vaccines and viruses. I'm also an associate professor of viral immunology at the University of Guelph in Canada, but the views that I'm expressing to you are solely my own. Next slide. So I'm an expert when it comes to vaccines. I develop and optimize vaccines. And so I'm a vaccinologist. I really understand the science underlying vaccines. So what I want to share with you today is just a few concerns that I have, a few out of the many concerns that I have relating to the science underpinning COVID-19 vaccines. And I'm going to start from the very foundation. So the primary rationale for vaccine mandates and masking mandates was this concept that there could be somebody sitting beside you who didn't feel sick. They felt perfectly healthy. You couldn't tell they were sick because they didn't appear sick, but they were somehow spewing enough of the SARS coronavirus 2 to reach a threshold dose that would infect you, even though they weren't coughing or sneezing, that would infect and kill you. That was the rationale. We call it asymptomatic transmission. Now, if you ask me, is asymptomatic transmission a real effect when it comes to SARS coronavirus 2? Yes. Asymptomatic transmission does occur. Likely very rarely. Was it a key driver of transmission for the past 2 years of the SARS coronavirus 2 pandemic? No, absolutely not. It did not contribute substantially to that. And I want to point out the reasons why. There's now a body of literature of at least 48 peer-reviewed published papers that argue in favor of asymptomatic transmission of SARS coronavirus 2. It is all fatally flawed. So we have an established scientific literature, but you have to understand it's fatally flawed, and I will tell you why. If you are going to run a study where you're looking at the potential to transmit the causative agent of COVID-19, you have to perform some kind of testing. And usually these papers rely solely on PCR tests, okay? And if you're going to use a PCR test, first of all, you have to understand that it cannot differentiate between material, genetic material that comes from an infectious virus versus virions or virus particles that are non-infectious. Cannot differentiate this test, okay? So what you have to do when you run these studies is you have to calibrate the test. You do that with a very simple functional virology assay. What you do is you take cells stripped of their antiviral properties, you put that nasopharyngeal swab that was taken, you take half of that and run your PCR test, and you find the cycle threshold at which it is positive. Then the other half you put on cells that are stripped of their antiviral properties. So if there's any viruses present, they'll infect the cells and kill them under microscope, just like this. So here's the cells, nice and healthy and happy. And if they if there's a virus present that is potentially infectious, it will kill these cells. You can see it's very simple to see under microscope. Now, unfortunately, too few, but there were a few labs around the world that did this. They figured out what is the cycle threshold of the PCR test at which you stop finding virus that can potentially infect somebody else. So in Canada, a group associated with the Public Health Agency of Canada did this, and you will see the results here. They admit that the PCR test detects RNA, not infectious virus. And so what did they conclude from their study when they calibrated it using this simple virology assay? They concluded that at a cycle threshold of less than 24, there was no evidence of infectious virions. That's very important when you consider that most people have assumed that up to 38 or 40 cycle thresholds, people are infectious. This is important. Remember this. Next slide. Remember the cutoff of 24 that was objectively determined here. So this is an example of one of the many papers that have been published where they have concluded that asymptomatic people could potentially be a problem. You can see that this is the conclusion of the paper here. Isolation of asymptomatic patients may be necessary to control the spread of SARS coronavirus 2. If you want to know that a paper like this is fatally flawed, you always go to the materials and methods section and you look, what was there, and you ask yourself, what was the rationale for setting their cycle threshold cutoff? You can see here, it was considered positive when the cycle threshold values of all genes were less than 40 cycles. There is no rationale. This was pulled out of a hat. I just showed you what they should have done. Had they done what was done in the previous study, they would have found that the cycle threshold cutoff to detect infectious virus particles would have been much lower. This is one of the figures from their paper where they have just randomly set the positive threshold for detection of infectious virus at 40 cycles. And what they have here is they have yellow symbols and blue symbols, which are symptomatic and asymptomatic people. And when you look at this, you can't differentiate them. They're all intermixed. And that's where they drew their conclusion. However, when you apply a cycle threshold of 24, all but one of those individuals are no longer positive. There was only one individual in that study, if 24 was the appropriate threshold, that could have potentially transmitted the virus to other people, and notably that one individual was symptomatic. So it's very simple. Sick people are the people who spread COVID-19. It's common sense. If you're sick, like with any other infectious disease, and you don't want to get other people infected, stay home. Next slide. Okay, now this is, I want to make this very clear. People have heard lots about vaccines and what vaccines are and what they are not. Turning vaccination terms into word salads like we have been doing over the past 2 years and continually moving the goalposts for what a vaccine is supposed to be confuses the public. You cannot have proper informed consent if you have the person who wants to administer the procedure and the person who has to provide the informed consent. If they aren't in agreement, if they don't share the same understanding of a term, they cannot be providing informed consent. So in Canada, we have a definition of an ideal vaccine. All right, and I want to point out, because scientific terms have very specific meanings, and we haven't been adhering to these specific meanings. An ideal vaccine is effective in providing lifelong, not dampening of the symptoms of disease, but lifelong protection against the disease after what? A single dose. Think about that in the context of the SARS-CoV-2 vaccines. In other words, according to the Canadian definition, we're as far away, these shots, COVID-19 shots, are as far away from being an ideal vaccine as they can possibly be, yet still fall under the definition, umbrella term of a vaccine. And the United States, after the emergency use authorization, they actually changed their definition of a vaccine. Note that they did not change. If you go through their Wayback Machine, you can find the definition before the summer of 2021. And the term immunity has not changed. To be immune means to be exempt from disease. It means you cannot get sick and you cannot transmit to other people. That's what it means. What they did is they removed the term immunity from the definition of a vaccine. This was simply to accommodate these new COVID shots, period. And so under their new definition now, yogurt would be considered a vaccine. As an immunologist, I'm not going to teach my students that yogurt is a vaccine. All right? This is the key. Most members of the public understand the traditional textbook definition of a vaccine, which is once you're vaccinated, you can enter the danger zone. Think about when you go to your physician and you're going to travel to an exotic location. They administer a vaccine if there is some kind of dangerous, potentially dangerous pathogen endemic to that region. What happens? You get the vaccine, your doctor wishes you well on your trip, and they look forward to seeing you again and hearing about your trip upon your return. That's because they know when you go, you're not going to get the disease and you're not going to bring it back to them. And that's what the public was thinking about when the term vaccine was applied to these shots. Next. And again, this has big implications for informed consent. In Europe, it's no different. I just wanted to show you, since we're in Europe, so this is what Europeans were told. Vaccination, right, is the main tool for what? Prevention of disease. Note, prevention, not dampening the severity of disease, preventing the disease. And again, here's this term immunity, which means to be exempt from disease. You don't get the disease and you don't transmit it. Vaccines contain antigens that confer immunity against specific pathogens. And what does the European Centre for Disease, Infection and Control, Prevention and Control actually list among their vaccine preventable diseases is COVID-19, right? That's the understanding that Europeans had when the term vaccine was being applied to the COVID-19 shots. Next slide. So then you have to ask the question, because then we were told, well, if they dampen the disease, that's good. Dampening the severity of disease was never the goal. We have to remember how far the goalposts were moved, okay? These vaccines were originally intended, we were all told very publicly that they would stop the disease and they would prevent transmission. We were all told that, all right? So don't accept the fact that dampening the severity of disease was ever the goal. And I want to share something with you. It's very important here. Through a Freedom of Information request, an important document was obtained. It was the contract between Pfizer and the United States Department of Defense. And I want to show you here. So here's a picture. This is the agreement. Here's the key wording right here. And it says, Pfizer and BioNTech entered into an agreement for the co-development of a mRNA-based vaccine intended to prevent infection. Prevent infection, not dampen the disease. All right? This is amazing because it was in this European Parliament that the members that have hosted us today highlighted to the world that they got Pfizer to admit that they never tested for the potential to stop transmission. And that's what you have to do. If you are going to honor an agreement where you're committed to making a vaccine that's going to stop infection, you have to test for transmission. And their excuses that they didn't have time and that it wasn't really feasible is an outright lie. My lab and thousands of labs around the world for about 10,000 euros could have run a study, a preclinical study in animal models within a couple of months and told you whether or not these shots had the potential to prevent transmission or not. All right? And we know that these vaccines cannot prevent infection or transmission. So in my opinion, Pfizer has failed to meet their contractual duty. Next slide. Okay, this is the other thing. So when these trials were published, some others have already mentioned this, that there's a big difference between relative risk and absolute risk. And all that has been exclusively published when it comes to these COVID-19 shots has been the relative risk. The absolute risk reduction, for example, in the original trial was under 1%, the absolute risk reduction, but everybody heard that it was 95% effective, right? That's the relative risk. I want to point out to you, the U.S. health regulatory agencies all around the world, but in this case, this is the United States Food and Drug Administration, but they all agree on the same thing. Provide absolute risks, not just relative risks. Patients are unduly influenced when risk information is presented using a relative risk approach. This can result in suboptimal decisions. Thus, an absolute risk format should be used. Yet that was not done at any point over the past 3 years. Next slide. And I want to show you there's all kinds of ways the data were manipulated and hidden. I just want to highlight very quickly just two of many examples. We had data from Alberta, Canada, showing that after the first dose of the Pfizer vaccine, there was this very unusual clustering of cases and hospitalizations in very close proximity to that dose. In other words, you expect this to be very randomly distributed, but it was not. This is clear evidence that the first dose was causing increased acute susceptibility to COVID-19. And yet all of these cases, of course, this was after the first shot, within the first 2 weeks, all of these cases, although caused by the vaccine increasing susceptibility to COVID-19, were attributed to the unvaccinated. Also, our government, one of our governments, provincial governments in Canada, had to admit that a majority of cases and a majority of intensive care unit admissions, a majority of them were not because of COVID, but with COVID, and I have to correct that as well. It's not actually with COVID, it's with a positive PCR test result, which means the people may or may not have had COVID, and they have refused to overlay this data based on vaccination status. And when that happens, that's a red flag. It's probably because it doesn't support the narrative that this was a pandemic of the unvaccinated. Next slide. Also, I want to show, because people still will argue, well, okay, if it stops the most severe outcomes, isn't that a good thing? Well, Pfizer's own 6-month clinical trial data update shows you something very important. When they looked at deaths, those that had been vaccinated, in the vaccinated group, there were 15 deaths. In the group that was unvaccinated, there were 14 deaths. Then they shut down the control group after 4 months, right? And they vaccinated them all. After vaccinating those in the placebo group, there were an additional 5 deaths. So the whole point being there were numerically more deaths in the vaccinated group than the unvaccinated. It was not statistically significant. So this is what you would conclude as a scientist. There is no statistically significant benefit of the COVID-19 vaccine in reducing death. So it doesn't even help in the context of the most severe outcome. Interestingly, there are almost twice as many deaths due to cardiovascular events in the vaccinated group than in the unvaccinated group, showing that even way back, there was a safety signal for cardiac events. Now we're so familiar with myocarditis, et cetera. Next slide. Okay, and so very quickly here, I just want to point out, here's 108 studies that show that natural immunity works, okay? It's valid, and yet we have not accepted that over the past 2 years. Next. And this highlights something right here. I just want to point out the green lines here, and the higher you are on this graph, the better the outcome. The green line is natural immunity. These other lines are all various combinations of vaccines. And the whole point being that whether you're looking at infection or the severity of the disease, natural immunity is superior in every way, shape, and form to the immune responses conferred by the vaccines. Next. And by this point in time, I would be surprised if there's anybody left in the world who has not been infected with this virus. And very quickly, we know this. I just want to use the example here so you see it's real science. We know in any population, when you administer a vaccine, you're always going to have non-responders, those that have simply not mounted an immune response. This is very important because if you have not mounted an immune response, guess what the issue is? You're at risk for being infected. And so this shows the lunacy of the vaccine passports. For some reason, we never bothered to look at any evidence of whether somebody actually had generated an immune response against SARS-CoV-2. And this is important because people who had naturally acquired immunity were segregated. And yet, including those who had clear evidence that they had naturally acquired immunity, while there were a bunch of people walking around with certificates that said people saw 2 needles go in their arm, and they might not have mounted an immune response whatsoever, but they were allowed to live freely, even though they were technically much more dangerous to those around them. Next slide. Okay, and then I just want to point out very quickly that those, again, natural immunity, here, whether it's the Pfizer vaccine or the Moderna one, is superior to the vaccine-induced immunity, and both in terms of cases, but also in terms of the severity of disease, hospitalizations, and deaths. And when we are getting more and more transparent data from public health agencies around the world, we're starting to see that there might even be a concern that the vaccines are making people more susceptible to the COVID-19, and those, especially those that have been boosted with the bivalent vaccines, may actually be more susceptible to severe disease. Next. And so I just want to finish with this, a few discussion points to consider. All right, vaccines that fail to stop infection and transmission can drive the emergence of new variants. This is the same principle that we've seen for chemotherapy resistance in cancers and antibiotic resistance with bacteria. All right, and that is that if you have a biological entity prone to mutation and you apply a non-lethal selective pressure, you are going to drive the emergence of variants. So their widespread use must be stopped. We need to place a worldwide moratorium on the use of mRNA vaccine technology for all species, not just people. You might not understand that we are fast-tracking all kinds of mRNA vaccines for animals. And we have to understand, especially when you think about the fact that we now know the mRNA vaccines get into breast milk, we have to start asking what are the implications of our mRNA vaccines getting into our food system, like through cow's milk, eggs, meat, etc. We need to acknowledge the value of naturally acquired immunity. We need to hire back the people who lack a COVID-19 vaccine certificate, give them full pay. We need to offer fair compensation packages for those who do not want to return because their work environment is now too poisoned against them. We also need comprehensive reviews of funding structures for public regulatory agencies to see if there are potential conflicts of interest. We need to restaff these regulatory agencies with scientists of integrity. We need to make sure they have the security, the job security to speak out when they do have concerns. We also have to make raw data from the submission packages that go to the regulatory agencies available and novel public health data available for objective third-party scientists to review it. And I'd like to just finish off by thanking the honourable members of the European Parliament that are hosting us today. I really appreciate the fact that you are allowing us to speak uncensored and provide truthful information. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you to members of the European Parliament for hosting us and inviting me to speak, and our ICS organizing group for inviting me. We have the first slide. Good. It says I'll move over. Okay. So I'm going to speak only very briefly and about something that I apologize in advance can be a little bit technical. I'm an epidemiologist. I'm used to being technical. My students have always complained that I'm technical, and I tell them, but it's science, and science is technical, and what can I do about that? Okay, next slide, please. So this is a somewhat complicated slide looking at studies of the Moderna vaccine. I'm skipping ahead to the Omicron era. During the pre-Omicron era for the variants of the virus, there's many studies. They show more or less the same thing, but it's much more clear and much more relevant to us now to look at what's happened in Omicron. And one can see in the charts on the right, the vertical line in the middle is no efficacy of preventing infection, and you can see each line in the different variants is time from after the vaccination or the last dose occurred, and you can see over time that the efficacies go down towards zero, and in a few cases go below zero. The chart on the left shows what happens with 4 doses, and it doesn't help. So that's been a characteristic of the Moderna vaccine. Could I have the next slide, please? This is the Pfizer vaccine looked at in 51,000 employees in the Cleveland Clinic. And each line in different colors, it starts from 0 doses of the vaccine at the bottom and going up 1, 2, 3, and more than 3 doses. The x-axis, the horizontal, is time, and the vertical axis is risk of infection. And you can see the more doses one has had, no matter which time point you're at, the risk goes up of getting COVID with more doses of the vaccine. And this is the Pfizer vaccine. Next slide, please. Here is a study of both Moderna and Pfizer vaccines in Qatar. And the same thing again here, that one sees that after 4 to 6 months, in fact, the efficacy of the vaccines become negative, which means that vaccinated people are more likely to get infected with COVID than unvaccinated people who've never been vaccinated. The sections on the right are for the boosters, and there wasn't enough time to follow them for long enough, but the same thing eventually happens for 3 or more doses on the boosters. Next slide, please. So these data throughout Omicron led the CDC, our CDC, to state on August 11th of last year that the vaccines do not work for the purposes of public health infection control. And their exact statement is in this box, which is receipt of a primary series alone, that's 2 doses, in the absence of being up to date with vaccination, that means whatever boosters they define, through receipt of all recommended booster doses, provides minimal protection against infection and transmission. Minimal protection. Being up to date with vaccination, meaning getting the most recent booster, provides a transient period of increased protection against infection and transmission after the most recent dose, although protection can wane over time. So for me, as a public health person, the idea of transient and waning is not part of my public health lexicon. We need to have methods of managing a pandemic that last for more than weeks to a month or 2. And they have said in this statement that the vaccines do not fulfill that role for public health management. Now, I assert the logical conclusion is the only state interest in mandating vaccines is to prevent transmission. That whether or not they prevent severity of illness is not a state interest. The state can always build more hospitals if it needs to. The $150 billion that we spent doing the wrong thing could have been spent in the U.S. building more hospitals. So the issue of disease severity is not a state interest. What's a state interest is preventing unwilling people from getting vaccinated, from getting infected by their neighbors or whatever, and the vaccine should prevent transmission. And here you see that the state, the CDC, says that the vaccines don't do that. And to me, that is the end of the story. That is the statement that the vaccines should and cannot be mandated for prevention of infection, and the state no longer has an interest in that fact. Now, I want to, next slide, please. I want to just briefly touch on something about another one of the ridiculous frauds in evaluating the efficacy of vaccines that my colleagues have talked about in other terms, but in epidemiology, there are only 3 kinds of studies that can be done. They're called cross-sectional studies, randomized trials or cohort studies, which are identical, and case control studies. The only difference between these studies is how one selects the total number of people. In a cross-sectional study, you select a whole bunch of people, and then you see whether they're cases or controls and whether they got vaccinated or not. In a cohort study or a randomized trial, you pick a number who are exposed and a number who get the vaccine, a number who don't get the vaccine, and you see how many become cases, how many get infected. And in a case control study, you do the opposite. You pick the number of people who got infected and the number who didn't get infected, and you see in their history how many of them have been vaccinated in each group. Okay, next slide. In the randomized controlled trials, the analysis should be done by vaccine efficacy. One calculates the relative risk, which we've heard about, the bad parameter according to some, although as an epidemiologist I kind of live with that, as 1 minus the relative risk. 100% minus the relative risk is the vaccine efficacy. However, in case control studies cannot estimate relative risk. They estimate what's called an odds ratio, which may or may not be accurate for the relative risk, and they use 1 minus that for vaccine efficacy. Okay, next slide, please. So here is the original CDC publication of efficacy after the 3rd dose of the vaccine. They enrolled 4,094 patients. They excluded some, so they ended up with 2,900 patients, and then they classified them as to whether they were infected or not and vaccinated or not. By definition, that's a cross-sectional study. But they didn't analyze it as a cross-sectional study. This is the CDC. They analyzed it as a case control study. Next slide, please. And they found a claimed vaccine efficacy of 82%, which sounds great. But in fact, the cases and controls in this are not infrequent, which means the odds ratio is a bad parameter to use. And they provided the actual data in the table from which one could calculate the relative risk, which I did here. And it shows that the actual vaccine efficacy in the study is 56%, not 82%. And astonishingly, the CDC has made this same error in almost every vaccine efficacy analysis that it's published in its in-house journal Morbidity Mortality Weekly Report. This is a systematic fatal flaw in every one of these publications. Next slide, please. And I don't see how the CDC could get 50-plus professional authors, MDs, PhDs, public health people, authoring every one of these papers saying these absurd claims about vaccine efficacy when they've used the wrong methods that are fatally flawed. And this, to me, is one of the most egregious factors as why I don't believe the CDC for anything. We know it's a corrupted agency, as the FDA has been, and so on. We've seen this very obviously in the last 3 years. And I'm sorry to say that this is what my government has been doing, and it's made me give second thoughts to how I consider what the appropriateness of our government activities. So thank you very much for your attention.